Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever wondered where the footprints in the sand lead? What if they don't just disappear with the tide, but instead, they keep going, stretching into the vast, silent water, never turning back? And what if, each morning, new footprints appear, as if someone, or something, has returned to walk again? I wasn't sure what had brought me here. The beach had always been a place of comfort, a quiet refuge from the noise of everyday life. But today was different. The air was heavier, thicker, like something was waiting for me. I tried to shake off the feeling as I stepped onto the cool sand, the waves gently lapping at the shore, the distant call of seagulls echoing in the sky. Everything seemed normal at first, too normal. But then I saw them. The footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp, as though the person who had left them had only just passed. I followed them with my eyes, the trail curving toward the water. There was something strange about them. The prints were deep, as though the person who made them weighed more than anyone I had ever known. And as I looked closer, I realized the most unsettling detail: there were no prints leading back. No footprints going the other way. The trail ended in the water, where the waves were gently creeping up the shore, ready to swallow it all up. My stomach churned as I stood there, staring at the water, at the place where the prints disappeared. What kind of person walks into the ocean and never comes back? I took a few tentative steps toward the water, my heart pounding in my chest. My feet sank into the sand, the soft grains shifting with each step. But no matter how close I got, I couldn't understand why the prints had stopped so suddenly. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that someone had been swept away. Just nothing. I turned back, trying to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself that it was nothing more than an odd curiosity. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, staring at me. But the beach was empty as it had been when I first arrived. I tried to push the thought from my mind. I was being ridiculous, imagining things. There was nothing to be afraid of. But the unease lingered, a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I tried to focus on the beauty of the ocean, the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore. I forced myself to relax. But when I returned the next day, there they were again. The footprints. Fresh, unmistakable, and once more leading into the water, disappearing without a trace. I stood frozen, unable to move, as a cold shiver ran down my spine. This time, there was no mistaking it. The footprints weren't a coincidence. They weren't random. They were deliberate. The trail was meant for me to find. I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on the marks in the sand, trying to find some explanation, some rational reason for what I was seeing. But there was nothing. The beach was empty, the waves were still, and yet, the prints were there, as real and undeniable as the air I was breathing. I reached out, my hand trembling, as I brushed a finger against one of the prints. The sand was still warm. Whoever had made these prints had been here recently, and yet there was no one in sight. I felt a sudden wave of panic rise in my chest. My breath quickened as I backed away, my heart racing in my ears. Why were they here? Why did they keep appearing? And why did they always lead into the water? I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the sand as I made my way back toward the nearby cliffs. But even as I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, something unseen, something that had been watching me all along. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that there was a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I felt it in my bones, in the cold, restless air that seemed to wrap itself around me. The next morning, I went back to the beach. The sun was barely rising, casting a pale glow over the sand. And there they were again. The footprints. This time, they were deeper, more pronounced, as though the person who had made them was heavier, their steps more deliberate. I stood still, my breath caught in my throat as I watched the marks stretch toward the water once more. But this time, something was different. The waves weren't gentle. They were churning, crashing against the shore, as though the ocean itself was restless, angry. I stepped closer to the water, my feet moving on their own, almost as if I was being pulled forward. The air grew colder, the waves rising higher, crashing more violently against the shore. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure. A silhouette standing at the edge of the water, just beyond the waves. It was impossible to make out any details, but I could feel the presence of something not human. The figure stood there for a long time, motionless, staring out at the horizon. The waves crashed louder now, as if they were warning me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. My feet were glued to the sand, my body frozen in place as I watched the figure. It wasn't until the figure started to move that I realized what was happening. The footprints. They weren't leading into the water for no reason. They were leading to this figure. The ocean was calling it. Calling for me, too. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted back to the cliffs. I could still hear the waves behind me, crashing louder and louder, the sound of the figure's steps echoing in my mind. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The water was coming. The footsteps would lead me there. And there was no way out. When I reached the top of the cliffs, I looked back at the beach. The figure was gone, but the footprints remained, stretching into the water. And as the waves swallowed the last of them, I knew, deep down, that this would never end. Tomorrow, the footprints would return. And they would lead me back. The next morning, the sky was overcast, a heavy fog creeping over the horizon. The air smelled damp, salty, and thick, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. I walked slowly toward the beach, each step feeling heavier than the last. My feet dragged in the wet sand as though I were walking through treacle, the sense of dread weighing me down. When I reached the shoreline, I didn't have to look long. There they were again. The footprints. Fresh, clear, and leading straight into the water. The same unnerving pattern. The same eerie silence surrounding them. The tide had receded since yesterday, leaving the prints exposed for anyone to see. And yet, there was no one. No sign of the person who had made them. I stared at the marks in the sand, the chill of the morning air sinking into my skin. This time, I didn't feel the strange compulsion to follow the prints. I was too terrified. The figure from yesterday still haunted me, its silhouette looming in my thoughts. I wanted to turn and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't stop looking at the water. As if summoned by my gaze, the ocean began to stir, the waves rolling in faster, more violently than before. The wind picked up, pushing against me, tugging at my clothes. My heart raced, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Something ancient. Something waiting. The waves seemed to crash harder now, pounding the sand as if they were trying to tear the beach apart. The sound was deafening, and yet, beneath it all, I could hear something else. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a murmur carried on the wind, too distant to understand. But then it grew louder. Closer. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded familiar. A voice from my past, calling to me, beckoning me forward. I shook my head, willing myself to ignore it. But it was impossible. The whisper grew louder still, as if it was right behind me. My skin prickled with fear, my body trembling uncontrollably. I turned my head, half expecting to see the figure from the water, but there was nothing. Only the crashing waves, the wet sand, and the footprints that seemed to call me forward. I took a step back, the whisper now turning into a desperate, pleading cry. It was coming from the ocean. I knew it was. Before I could react, the wind shifted and the waves surged, pulling back suddenly, revealing the shape of something submerged just beneath the surface. It was difficult to see, but I could make out a figure, half submerged in the water, its arms stretched out as though reaching for me. I froze, unable to move. The figure in the water was no longer distant. It was here. And it was waiting. The voice called again, this time clearer, almost urgent. Come. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air was thick with salt and fear. The waves rose higher, the water pulling closer, as if the ocean itself was trying to swallow the shore. I took a hesitant step forward, my body unwilling, but my mind inexplicably drawn to the figure. Don't go, I whispered to myself, trying to fight it, but the pull was too strong. The whisper was louder now, too insistent to ignore. I could feel the weight of it, as if the ocean itself were calling me, pulling me closer. The footprints, they were meant for me. They were always meant for me. Before I realized it, I was walking toward the water. Each step was a bow. My feet sank into the wet sand, the cold waves reaching my ankles, pulling at my legs with a force I couldn't resist. The sound of the ocean grew louder, drowning out all else. The figure in the water was close now. It was still far enough to be indistinct, but its shape was growing clearer with each step I took. I stopped when the water reached my knees, the cold seeping through my clothes, numbing my skin. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I couldn't fight them any longer. I reached out, stretching my hand toward the figure in the water. It was just within reach. My fingers brushed something soft, like fabric, and then nothing. It wasn't there. The figure had vanished. I stepped back in confusion, the water lapping at my legs. The whispers stopped. The waves fell silent. The beach was still again. I looked around, panic rising in my chest, but the footprints were gone. The sand was flat, untouched by any marks, as though they had never been there at all. The ocean was calm again, its surface smooth, like glass. The air felt lighter, though the unease in my gut lingered. What had just happened? What was that thing? The figure, the voice, the footprints, they were all too real, too vivid to ignore. But now, it was as if it had all been a dream. I looked out at the ocean once more, hoping to see something that would explain it, but the sea was empty. Silent. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I saw it again. The footprints. Fresh. Clear. Leading into the water. The pattern had changed slightly, but they were unmistakable. The trail was still there, waiting. I looked at the ocean once more, the waves slowly rolling in. And I knew, deep down, that I was no longer free. The ocean had called. The footprints were leading me back. And the water had already claimed its next victim. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore grew more rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. My feet were stuck in the sand, my body rigid with fear. The figure in the water was gone, but the whispering call was still present, hanging in the air like an invisible thread pulling at me. I couldn't explain it. The footprints were still there, still leading into the ocean, as if they were always waiting for me, guiding me, pulling me in. I wanted to run, to leave this beach and never look back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed by the fear that surged through me, a terror so deep that it settled into my bones. I looked around, desperate for some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. Just the empty beach, the crashing waves, and those damn footprints. I could hear the ocean calling, beckoning me forward, and no matter how much I willed myself to turn away, my feet took another step toward the water. It was as if my body had taken control of my mind, dragging me closer and closer to the shore. I stopped, trembling, when the water reached my waist. The cold bite of the ocean pierced through my clothes, but it wasn't enough to stop me. I felt a strange calmness wash over me, as though the waves themselves were whispering something familiar. It was a lullaby, soft and haunting, lulling me into a trance. I shouldn't be here. I should leave. But the feeling, the strange pull toward the ocean, was overwhelming. I needed to know. I had to know what this was. What the footprints meant. What was waiting for me in the water. What was waiting for me in the water. I looked out into the depths, the water dark and still, and I thought I saw something move beneath the surface. Just a glimpse. Something long and dark, shifting just out of reach. It sent a chill down my spine. Then, I saw it. The figure. The same figure from before, now clearer, standing just beneath the surface of the water. The same silhouette, arms outstretched. It was taller now, its shape more defined, the face obscured by the water, as if waiting for me to come closer. My heart raced as I stepped further in, each movement slower than the last. The waves seemed to push me toward the figure, pulling me under the surface as if they were trying to drown me. I was close now, so close I could almost reach out and touch the figure. But something stopped me. Something deep inside, a primal instinct, screamed at me to turn around, to flee. The figure's arms moved. Not just a slight shift, but a deliberate, fluid motion that brought it closer. It was no longer waiting. It was reaching for me. I froze, my heart in my throat. The whisper grew louder, but it was no longer a call. It was a command. Come to me. I could no longer fight it. I wasn't in control anymore. The ocean had claimed me. With a final step, I entered the deep water. It engulfed me, the waves swallowing me whole. As I sank beneath the surface, the last thing I saw was the figure, its face now clear. And it was smiling. The cold water wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, pulling me deeper into the dark abyss. My lungs screamed for air, but the ocean seemed to silence everything, drowning out even my thoughts. The figure was closer now, its silhouette impossibly tall, towering over me despite the depth of the water. It moved slowly, its limbs twisting in unnatural ways, almost as if the water itself was bending to its will. I tried to move, to swim, but my body felt heavy, as though the very ocean was holding me in place. My limbs refused to obey. I was trapped, suspended in the dark sea, my mind racing but unable to form any coherent thoughts. Panic gnawed at my insides, but my body remained numb, floating deeper. And then I heard it. The voice. It was no longer a whisper. It was right in my ear, cold and sharp, as though the ocean itself had spoken. Join us. I wanted to scream, to shout, to fight against whatever force was pulling me down, but the words stuck in my throat. The figure's face loomed closer now, its eyes two dark voids, empty and endless. It smiled again, so wide that its face seemed to stretch beyond reason, stretching farther than any human expression should be capable of. Come, it urged, its voice now booming in my ears, deafening. Come and walk with us. The water around me started to churn violently, the pressure increasing, pulling me in every direction. I tried to resist, to push against the suffocating force, but it was as if the ocean had become a living thing, its tendrils wrapping tighter and tighter around me, dragging me deeper into the inky depths. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as the weight of the water increased, my lungs burning, gasping for air that wasn't there. The figure's smile seemed to grow wider, impossibly wide, until I thought it would split its face in two. Its eyes fixed on me, unblinking, unfeeling. And then it moved. The figure didn't just step toward me. It glided, impossibly fast, crossing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and thin, almost like tentacles, and brushed against my face. The touch was icy cold, like the deepest parts of the ocean, and I flinched away from it. But it didn't let go. The figure's grip tightened, its fingers digging into my skin as if it were pulling me toward it, dragging me into the deep. "Join us," it repeated, its voice more insistent now, resonating in my skull. The last thing I remembered was the dark water closing in around me, the figure's touch still gripping me, and then nothing. When I awoke, the sun was high in the sky, casting a harsh light over the beach. The water lapped gently at the shore, the waves calm and serene, as though nothing had happened. I blinked, disoriented, my body aching as I sat up on the sand, gasping for air. My lungs burned, but I was breathing. I looked around. The beach was empty, quiet. No footprints. No sign of the figure. Nothing. The world seemed unchanged. But I knew better. I knew what had happened. I had seen the figure. I had felt its touch. And somehow it had let me go. Let me leave. I stumbled to my feet, my legs unsteady, and I tried to shake the feeling of the ocean still wrapping around me, the figure's cold fingers still clinging to my skin. The ocean had called. It always would. And it would always leave its mark on me. I walked away from the water, my heart still racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly free. Every step I took felt like it was pulling me back to the beach, to the waves, to the footprints. They would come again. I knew it. They always did. And the figure? It was still waiting. It all began with a question. I can't remember if I asked it aloud or just thought it. The question lingered in my mind as I stood in the bathroom, staring at the mirror, my fingers still damp from washing my hands. Is something wrong with this place? The reflection in the glass seemed normal, just like every other day. But there was something strange, something that didn't sit right with me. At first, it was almost unnoticeable, a faint, blurry mark on the surface of the mirror. It looked like a smudge, but no matter how hard I tried to clean it, it stayed. I wiped the mirror again and again, but the mark remained stubborn, growing clearer with each attempt. It was a handprint. I leaned closer, frowning. The print looked fresh, as though someone had pressed their hand against the glass just moments before. The impression was slightly distorted, the edges soft, as if the hand that made it had been sweaty or trembling. But there was no one else in the apartment. Just me. Alone. I took a deep breath, shaking my head as I backed away. It's nothing, I told myself. Just a trick of the light. You're overthinking things. But the feeling of unease lingered, creeping up my spine. I turned away, trying to distract myself. The sounds of the city outside drifted in through the window, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout of a passerby. But in the silence of my bathroom, the room felt oddly still. The air was thick, pressing down on me. I could almost hear my heartbeat, each pulse louder than the last. But when I glanced back at the mirror, the handprint was different. It wasn't the same one. The shape had changed, morphed into something else entirely, as if it were trying to escape the boundaries of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I could see the edges of the print, but now there was an outline of fingers, too long, too thin, pressing against the surface. They curled in unnatural ways, as if trying to reach through the mirror. I stepped closer, my heart racing. What is this? My eyes couldn't leave the reflection. The hand was still there, but now it seemed more alive. The fingers twitched. I swear I saw them move. The air around me grew colder, the room now filled with a low, distant hum, as though something were vibrating just beneath the surface of reality. A soft scrape against the mirror echoed through the room. It wasn't me. I took a quick step back, but the handprint remained, its form distorting with every glance. I couldn't look away, couldn't understand what was happening. What was it? How could it be? Suddenly, I felt a draft. A cold gust of air blew across the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The room felt wrong. I quickly turned and left the bathroom, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled deep in my chest. But as I walked through the hallway, I could still hear that faint, scraping sound, like something was trying to break free. Something was changing. Something was watching me. The door to the bathroom was ajar, and the darkened outline of the mirror called to me, pulling me back toward it. But I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see it again. Yet my feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the mirror once more. The handprint had changed again. Now, the fingers were splayed wide, pressing so hard against the glass that the surface seemed to ripple, distorting like water. I could almost feel the pressure through the mirror, as if someone on the other side was pushing against it, trying to break through. I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. The moment my skin made contact, a sharp chill shot through my fingertips, and I felt a slight resistance, as if the mirror were pushing back. But then, just as quickly, the feeling was gone. I pulled my hand away, my breath quickening. What was happening? What was causing this? My reflection seemed wrong. My face looked too pale, my eyes too wide. A shudder ran through me as I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in this room, and whatever was in that mirror was waiting for me to make the next move. The moment I pulled my hand away from the mirror, I felt the cold air bite at my skin. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I stared at the mirror, waiting for the handprint to change again, but it remained frozen in its unnatural form. It's just a trick of the light, I thought desperately. Just a reflection, nothing more. But the sinking feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the glass. Each time I looked, it seemed to shift, subtle at first, but undeniable. I turned and left the bathroom again, this time walking quickly, as if that might somehow outrun the strange presence I felt. The air in the apartment felt thick, charged. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, and each footstep seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the quiet hallway. I tried to focus on the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own heartbeat, anything that might anchor me in reality. I sat on the couch, my hands gripping the edge of the cushions. I tried to calm my thoughts, but the sense of unease was unbearable. I had to go back. I had to see it again. But the bathroom door stood ajar, as if inviting me. The mirror beckoned like a dark, silent watcher. With a deep breath, I stood up and walked slowly toward the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I crossed the threshold into the bathroom, the air grew colder again. My breath fogged in front of me, a sign of how much the temperature had dropped. I looked at the mirror. The handprint was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't just a handprint anymore. I could see fingers, too many of them, pushing against the surface, curling and stretching as if they were trying to reach through. The print seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by unseen waves. The edges of the hand were no longer soft. They were sharp, almost like claws. I reached out again, this time cautiously. The moment my fingertips brushed against the glass, I felt it. A pressure, a pull, as though the mirror wanted to drag me in. My heart raced, and my entire body went rigid with fear. The cold from the mirror was seeping into me, into my bones. I stumbled back, away from the glass, my eyes still locked on the handprint. I couldn't look away. This isn't real, I thought desperately, forcing my body to move. It can't be real. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a tug at the back of my neck, a presence, like something was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of something looming just beyond the corner of my vision, wouldn't leave. I took another step backward, my hands trembling, but when I turned toward the door, it was closed. The bathroom door had shut on its own, sealing me in. No. My mind screamed. No, no, no. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Panic surged through me. I slammed my palm against the door, but it didn't open. My breaths came in ragged gasps. I ran to the window, desperate to escape. The city lights outside were a blur, a distant world I couldn't reach. I tried to force the window open, but the latch wouldn't move. The cold draft grew stronger, swirling around me. The mirror, the reflection, was all I could focus on. The fingers were still there, pressing against the glass, moving slightly, like a slow, deliberate motion. I stumbled backward again, my pulse racing. The room seemed to shrink around me. The air felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. I turned to face the mirror once more, but this time, the reflection wasn't just distorted. It was wrong. It wasn't me in the mirror anymore. The face staring back at me had hollow eyes, black as night, and the skin was unnaturally pale, stretched tight over the bones. The mouth was open, lips twisted in an expression of something, hunger, perhaps. It was the face of something other. I gasped, stumbling back into the wall. The figure in the mirror mirrored my every movement. The handprints were now all over the glass, dozens of them, each one seeming to stretch toward me, as if they were reaching from the other side. I was trapped. No way out. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sensation of being trapped receded, leaving behind a cold silence. I looked at the door, and this time it opened. It was like the mirror had allowed me to leave, as if the thing on the other side had decided to let me go, for now. I stepped into the hallway, my legs shaking. I didn't look back. But the image of the reflection of that thing stayed with me. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished. It would be back. The door to the bathroom swung open with an eerie creak, and I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every part of me screamed to get as far away from that room as possible, to escape the nightmare that had already begun to take root in my mind. I stumbled into the living room, my legs barely holding me up. The apartment, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien, like I was no longer part of it. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deeper than they should be, as though they were creeping toward me. I could hear my breath, sharp and frantic, echoing in the silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried to steady myself, to breathe slowly, but my mind was spiraling. What just happened? I kept asking myself, was it real? A voice inside me, soft, insistent, whispered that it didn't matter if it was real or not. What mattered was that it was still there, waiting. I dared not return to the bathroom. Not yet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me back. That I couldn't escape. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the sound too harsh in the quiet apartment. It felt like I had been standing there for hours, though I knew it had only been minutes. The same weight of dread, the same chill, hung in the air, making everything feel wrong. And then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across glass. It came from the direction of the bathroom, quiet at first, but unmistakable. I froze. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded as though something was clawing at the mirror. Desperate. Furious. It was as though whatever was trapped on the other side of the glass was trying to break through. I moved without thinking, my legs carrying me back toward the bathroom despite every instinct telling me to run, to flee from whatever horror lay within. The door was ajar once more, and the low hum of the mirror seemed to pull at me, urging me closer. I could feel it again, the cold, the heavy air, pressing down on me. But this time, the door didn't creak as it opened. It was as though it slid open on its own, the movement so smooth, so unnatural, that my breath caught in my throat. The handprints were gone. But something worse was there instead. The mirror, once clear, now had a film over it, like condensation, but darker, swirling in slow, unnerving patterns. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, right in the center, was something new. A face. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anything I had seen before. The face was pale, distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to look straight through me. The skin was stretched tight, as though it were too thin, and the mouth, it was wide, too wide, like a smile that belonged to something that had no business being in this world. The edges of the face blurred, as though it was struggling to remain solid. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my throat. The air in the room was thick now, suffocating. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror, from the face that watched me with unblinking, predatory eyes. And then it moved. The face twisted, its smile stretching wider, almost impossibly so. It pressed up against the glass, as if trying to reach out to me. I could hear a sound, a low, guttural whisper, like words that were too soft to understand, but so full of malice that they made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my legs shaking so violently that I thought I might collapse. Then, the whispering stopped. I stared at the reflection, my mind racing, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure in the mirror was still there, still smiling, but now it was laughing. It was an awful sound, a laugh full of teeth and darkness. A laugh that seemed to shake the very air around me, reverberating in my bones. And then, the thing in the mirror spoke. "You can't leave." The words were not mine, not anything I could have imagined. They were a command, an echo of something ancient and powerful, something that existed on the other side of the glass. I recoiled, the fear choking me. My heart hammered in my chest. My breathing was ragged, uneven. I need to leave. I need to get out of here. But the door to the apartment was locked. The windows were shut tight. I was trapped, and I knew deep in my gut that I was being watched, that it was waiting for me to make the next move. I felt the pressure again, that pull, as if the mirror was reaching for me, its fingers brushing against the glass on the other side. I could feel it in my bones, a cold, relentless force that was closing in, slowly but surely. The laughter grew louder. And just like that, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The reflection wasn't just a reflection. It was alive. And it wanted me. I turned to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. The door slammed shut in front of me, trapping me in the room with the mirror, with the thing that was no longer just a reflection. I reached out, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck. And then, I heard the most terrifying thing of all, the sound of fingers tapping against the mirror. Slowly. Deliberately. Closer. 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 The tapping echoed through the room, so soft at first, but then louder, faster, as if the thing was getting closer to me, inch by inch. I turned around. The thing in the mirror was smiling. And it was coming for me. No, no, no. I didn't know what was real anymore. All I knew was that I had to get out. But it was already too late. The thing in the mirror had already begun to reach through. I could feel it now, the cold, creeping through the air, wrapping around my skin like icy fingers. The tapping, faint at first, had become a steady rhythm, growing louder with every passing second. I wasn't just trapped in the room anymore. I was trapped in its grip. The thing in the mirror was no longer a passive reflection. Its hand, its claw-like fingers, pressed against the glass, curling, reaching, pushing harder. Each tap was like a heartbeat, a promise that something was getting closer, inch by inch. The space between us was shrinking, the glass vibrating ever so slightly, as if it too could sense the danger. I tried to move, tried to force myself to act, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My body felt as though it were being held in place by an invisible force, as though the room itself was holding me captive. Every breath felt heavier, more labored, the air thick with an oppressive weight that crushed down on me. It's in the mirror, I thought desperately. It's in the reflection. It's coming for me. I couldn't look away. I didn't dare. The face in the mirror was still there, still smiling, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. But now, it was shifting, distorting, as if it couldn't quite maintain its shape. It was slipping, sliding, becoming something else, something far more monstrous. The edges of the reflection were tearing apart, as if the very fabric of reality was being ripped open, allowing something to break free. A hand, a pale, clawed hand, appeared on the surface of the mirror, pressing through the thin layer that separated me from it. The fingers stretched, reaching further, and with each passing second, the space between the hand and the glass seemed to grow thinner. It was coming through. No. The thought echoed in my mind, louder than any scream I could make. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the hand was real. It was solid. I could see the tendons stretch, the jagged edges of its fingers scraping across the glass. The mirror's surface warped under the pressure, distorting, rippling as though the hand was pushing through a veil. The thing was pulling itself free. I had to stop it. I didn't know how, but I had to try. My hand shook as I reached out toward the mirror, toward the thing that was so close to breaking free. My fingertips brushed the cold glass, and for a moment, I thought I might be able to stop it, hold it back, somehow. But as soon as I touched the surface, everything changed. The mirror didn't just ripple, it shattered. The glass cracked, splintered into 1,000 shards, each one falling to the floor with a soft, almost melodic sound. And with the breaking of the glass came a rush of cold air, a gale that swept through the room, knocking me back onto the floor. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. The world around me spun as the wind howled, but the mirror was gone. Or at least, it should have been. There was no reflection, no glass, no surface to trap what was behind it. But that's when I saw it. The thing was no longer confined to the mirror. It was free. It stood in front of me now, a figure that towered over me, its face a nightmare of twisted features. Its eyes, black, empty, endless, locked onto mine. Its mouth, stretched impossibly wide, opened in a grin that sent a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the shards of glass that littered the floor. The creature stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the floor, as if it were hovering, as if it were beyond the rules of this world. And it spoke again. "You can't escape." The voice wasn't just in my ears. It was in my mind, inside my thoughts, crawling through every part of me. The words were like poison, dripping into my consciousness, sinking into my soul. I turned and ran, my feet stumbling over the glass, my breath coming in frantic gasps. I had to get out. I had to. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long, the walls narrowing with each step. The exit was just ahead, but no matter how fast I ran, I never seemed to get any closer. The sound of its footsteps, slow, deliberate, followed me, growing louder with every passing second. It's getting closer. I could feel it, the heat of its presence, its breath on my neck, its fingers reaching out to touch me. It was there, just behind me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught me. The front door was just ahead. One final push. I slammed my hand against the door handle, but it didn't open. It wouldn't. I twisted the knob, desperation flooding my mind, my body aching with the effort. The door refused to budge. It was locked. It had always been locked. I heard a slow, cruel laugh from behind me. Turning around, I saw it right there, standing in the hallway, watching me with its endless, black eyes. Its smile was wide, predatory. It didn't need to move any closer. It was already there, inside me, its presence suffocating every thought. This is it. I thought numbly. This is the end. But then I realized something. The glass wasn't the only barrier. It couldn't break through everything. It couldn't reach me if I broke free of the boundaries it had placed around me. I had one chance to escape. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and ran toward the nearest window, my hand scrambling to pull it open. The window was stuck, but I forced it, tearing at the frame until it gave way. I squeezed through, the cold night air rushing to meet me. I was outside, but I wasn't free. Behind me, the thing in the hallway was still there, watching. And I knew, deep in my gut, that it wouldn't stop. It wouldn't let me go. Not now, not ever. It had followed me into the world outside the mirror. It was waiting. And it would always be waiting. The air outside was cold, biting, but it did nothing to quell the burning panic in my chest. I stood there, in the alleyway, gasping for breath, my body trembling from more than just the chill. My legs shook as I forced myself to move, but the sensation of being watched never left me. My skin crawled with the certainty that it was still out there, still following me. I ran, heart pounding, not knowing where I was going. The city felt distant, surreal, as though I had crossed some invisible threshold into a place I didn't belong. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the wind seemed to carry its presence. The thing from the mirror had followed me, just as I had feared. It had left the confines of the glass, its form now lurking just beyond the corners of my vision, waiting for the right moment to claim me. The streets felt too quiet, as if the world had grown silent to listen for something terrible. The streetlights flickered in and out, casting fleeting pools of light on the darkened road. I stumbled past them, every step heavy with dread, wishing I could outrun the terror that clung to me like a second skin. I turned a corner, desperate to find safety, but instead of the comfort I hoped for, I found an endless stretch of empty buildings, their windows dark and vacant. I knew this part of town. It was deserted at night, no one around for blocks. It should have felt safe, but instead, it made me feel like a target, exposed and alone. I stopped and turned around, hearing nothing but the rush of blood in my ears. The street behind me was empty, no sign of anyone, nothing unusual. But then, a whisper reached me, faint but unmistakable. "You can't hide." The words were like ice, seeping into my mind and paralyzing me. They weren't just spoken, they were felt, like the weight of someone standing too close, breathing down my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I ran faster, ignoring the stitch in my side, the sharp ache in my chest. I needed to get home. I needed to lock myself away from whatever was stalking me. I reached my apartment building and pushed the door open, rushing inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely manage. The second the last bolt clicked into place, I slumped against the door, feeling the weight of exhaustion crash over me. But as I stood there, panting in the dark hallway of my apartment, something felt wrong. The silence was too deep. The hum of the building's usual creaks and groans was absent, replaced with an eerie stillness. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I knew, without a doubt, that I was not alone. I turned around, my breath shallow and fast, my pulse thundering in my ears. The hallway behind me seemed endless, stretching farther than it should, the shadows pulling at the edges of my vision. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, motionless and watching. Its face, its grotesque, stretched face, was grinning at me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The smile that curled across its lips was wide, impossibly wide. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me, closing in with every passing second. I should have run. I should have screamed. But all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the thing in the hallway began to step forward. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. The floor creaked under its weight, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the apartment. The thing in the hallway didn't need to speak. I could hear it. I could feel it. It was coming for me, and there was nowhere left to hide. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the floor. But there was no way out. The hallway was narrowing, the walls closing in, and the thing was getting closer, its grin widening with each step. "You can't escape," it whispered again, its voice low and guttural, but I could hear it inside my head, crawling through my thoughts, making them twist and turn in terror. I backed up toward the elevator, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my throat was dry, paralyzed. The thing was almost upon me. I could hear its breath now, low and labored, like it was struggling to hold itself together. The smile stretched even wider, and its eyes gleamed with a malicious joy. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me. And then, just as I thought it would reach me, the lights flickered once more, casting the hallway in darkness. I didn't have time to react. The thing was upon me, its icy touch brushing against my shoulder, sending a shock of cold straight into my bones. But then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The air was still. The lights returned to normal, and the hallway was empty. I stood there, my heart pounding, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I dared not move, too afraid that the slightest sound would bring it back. And that's when I heard it, the softest scrape, like nails on wood. It was coming from behind me. I didn't need to look. I knew what it was. It was still there. I turned around slowly, my breath caught in my throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, was the bathroom door, wide open. Inside, the mirror reflected nothing but the same dark emptiness. But then, ever so slightly, I saw it. A handprint. This time, there was no glass to hold it back. The handprint was pressed against the wall, the fingers stretching as if trying to crawl through, leaving behind an impression of something dark, something malevolent. And there, within the reflection of the dark hallway, I saw the same smile. It was waiting. And this time, there was no escape. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, but you couldn't see them? Maybe you felt that presence in a crowded room, or when you're walking alone at night. You hear things, or you think you hear things, and for a split second, you wonder if it's just your imagination or something more. That was how it started for me. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I had just finished work and was on my way home, earbuds in, listening to the latest track I had downloaded. The beat was familiar, the music easy to get lost in. I often used music to drown out my thoughts, to block out the world and the noise of my own mind. It helped me focus, helped me forget. But this time, it didn't. I had been walking down the familiar street near my apartment building when it happened. Turn left. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the music. At first, I thought it was a part of the song, a whisper or some background effect, something I hadn't heard before. But then it came again, clearer this time. Turn left now. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks. The voice was strange. It wasn't in the music, not a part of the track at all. It was something else, a real voice, as though someone was speaking directly into my ear. I pulled the earbuds out, standing still in the middle of the sidewalk. People walked past me without a second glance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My skin felt tight, my pulse quickened. I glanced around. No one seemed to notice me or care, but my mind raced with questions. Had I heard it wrong? Was I just tired, maybe imagining things? But no! I was sure. The voice was there, clear as day. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should ignore it. But curiosity gnawed at me. I had to know. I turned left. The moment I did, the feeling of unease lifted, but only for a moment. Something about the turn, about the direction, felt off. It was as though I had crossed some invisible boundary, some line I couldn't uncross. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, distracted. A message from my friend Matt. You coming over tonight? Gotta talk about some stuff. I quickly typed a reply, trying to push the strange voice out of my mind. Not tonight. I'm tired. Catch up later. But as I typed, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't a command. It was a statement, a fact. I know you're alone tonight. I froze, the phone still in my hands. I hadn't heard any sound other than the buzz of the message. No one was speaking around me. But somehow, the voice was clearer than ever. It was impossible, but it was happening. My fingers trembled as I put the earbuds back in, hoping it would stop, that maybe I could drown out the growing panic in my chest. But no! The voice kept coming. You always push people away, don't you? Afraid they'll leave you. I stopped in my tracks again, a wave of cold washing over me. I knew this was wrong. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Was it a prank? A weird glitch? But the voice sounded too real, too personal. Who was this? I hurried home, my pace quickening, the voice still whispering in my ear. It knew things. Things no one else knew. About my isolation. About the way I kept people at arm's length, afraid they would hurt me. It spoke of things that I hadn't told anyone, things I hadn't even allowed myself to fully admit. I opened the door to my apartment and stepped inside, slamming it behind me. I needed to calm down. I needed to breathe. But as I sat on the couch, the voice didn't stop. You can't escape me. It wasn't just in the music anymore. The voice seemed to be all around me, inside my head, in the very air I breathed. I pulled off the headphones and threw them on the coffee table. The silence that followed was deafening. But that didn't last long. The whisper came again, quiet, but sharp. You should have listened. I looked around the room, heart pounding. But there was nothing, no one there. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Yet the voice continued. You're being watched. I stood up, trembling, and walked over to the window, looking out into the dark street below. My eyes scanned the scene, but everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. No one was there. But the voice was still there, always in the background, always a step ahead. It knew things about me. It knew what I feared, what I hid from others. And I didn't know how to stop it. I grabbed my phone and texted Matt again. Something weird is happening. I need your help. But there was no reply. Not even the little dot to show that my message had been seen. Matt's not going to help you, the voice whispered again, cold and chilling, as though it had read my message before I even sent it. I dropped my phone, my hands shaking. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. I wasn't sure if I was going crazy or if something much darker was happening. Something beyond my control. I needed answers. And I had to find them before the voice found me. Before it knew more than it already did. But the longer I listened, the more I realized something terrifying. It was only just beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. The way it seemed to know me, my fears, my secrets, had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. What if it was someone I knew? Someone close to me, manipulating my reality? But no one had access to my headphones or my music. It didn't make sense. I spent the night tossing and turning, sleep eluding me as I lay wide-eyed in the dark. The voice kept whispering, taunting me. It was as though it had never left, still lingering, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I tried to convince myself it was a figment of my imagination, that I had simply been overtired. But no, it was real. At some point, in the dead of night, I reached for my phone again, hoping for some sort of normalcy, a distraction. I opened the music app and turned on a playlist I hadn't listened to in weeks. I needed to drown out the voice. I needed it to stop. But as the music played, I heard it again. That's not the song you wanted. I froze, earbuds in place, my fingers trembling on the edge of my phone. How did it know? I hadn't even selected the song yet. Go ahead, try again. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to, but I had to. With a shaky breath, I switched the song. The voice was right. I had been about to select something entirely different. As the new track began, the voice didn't stop. You never do what you want. You just go through the motions. Hiding. Always hiding. I yanked the earbuds out once again, the sudden silence in the room almost suffocating. My mind raced. It couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. I jumped off the couch and paced around the room, my thoughts scattered, my head spinning. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had hacked into my phone, controlling everything. But there was no way they could know what I was thinking, what I was feeling. The things it said weren't just guesses. They were too specific, too personal. The room felt colder, darker. The walls seemed to close in around me. My apartment, once familiar, now felt alien. Even the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, felt wrong, like they were part of the voice's influence. I wasn't alone. The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just in my ear. It seemed to come from everywhere. Your life isn't your own anymore. You're mine now. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for an explanation. What did it mean? Was it some kind of technological glitch? Or was there something more sinister happening? Could this be real, or was I losing my mind? The voice wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like it was inside me, crawling under my skin, twisting my thoughts. I grabbed my phone again, desperate for some answer, some reason behind this madness. I opened the music app, but as soon as I did, the screen flickered, showing strange lines of code before returning to the playlist. Stop trying to fight it, the voice said, colder than ever. You're already a part of me. I threw the phone across the room in a fit of panic, watching it crash against the wall. But the voice didn't stop. It didn't even pause. You think you can get rid of me that easily? Foolish. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't matter. The voice was inside my head now, echoing through every corner of my mind. I tried to think. I had to be rational. I couldn't let it control me, couldn't let it make me paranoid. But as the hours stretched on, my mind started to fracture. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't ignore it any longer. The voice had power, more than I could understand. The only thing I could think to do was to confront it, to find a way to make it stop. But how? How could I fight something I couldn't even see? How could I stop a voice that was inside my head? Suddenly, a sound came from behind me. A soft, slow rustle, like someone was walking toward me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat. The silence was deafening, yet the presence was still there, lurking just beyond my vision, just out of reach. It was in the air around me, in the shadows of the room. Don't turn around, the voice whispered from behind me, low and insistent. My muscles tensed. I could feel the cold breath of fear creeping up my spine. But I had to. I had to look. I had to see. I slowly turned my head. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. A shadow, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but it was there, watching me. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was undeniable. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was like the voice had manifested, had taken form. It was no longer just a sound, no longer just in my ears. The voice was this thing in front of me. This creature, this presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The only thing I could do was watch as it took a step closer, slowly, deliberately. "Do you really think you can escape me now?" the voice asked, its tone filled with dark amusement. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, slamming through the door of my apartment, not daring to look back. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was running from. All I knew was that the voice was everywhere, and no matter how far I went, it would never stop. It had already taken control. And now, it was hunting me. I ran through the empty streets, the cold night air biting at my skin. My heart pounded in my chest as if it wanted to break free, as if it could outrun the terror that followed me. I didn't know what I was running from, but I couldn't stop. The voice had followed me. I could hear it, faint at first, but growing clearer with every step. "You can't run forever," it whispered, low and insistent, a threat hidden in the soft words. "You can't escape yourself." I picked up the pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I needed to get away from the apartment, from everything that felt wrong. My mind raced. Where could I go? Who could help me? The streets were eerily silent. Not a single car passed by. No one was out at this hour. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something chasing me, but there was nothing. Just shadows stretching long across the pavement, reaching for me. The voice spoke again, louder this time, cutting through the silence. "I've been with you your whole life. You just never listened." I stopped in my tracks, hands gripping my head as I tried to shut it out. The words echoed in my skull, vibrating through my entire body. My head throbbed with pain. I couldn't take it anymore. It felt like the voice was inside me, filling every corner of my mind, every thought. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The streetlights flickered above me, casting harsh, jagged shadows across the pavement. "What?" "I don't want anything from you," the voice replied, its tone too calm, too casual for what it was saying. "I already have you." I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. The voice was right. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it was always there, inside me. It was always watching. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. There had to be a way to stop this. A way to fight back. But what if it wasn't just a voice? What if it was something more? Something that controlled everything, the music, the technology, my thoughts? Something that had always been there, waiting for me to notice? I ran, not sure where I was going, just needing to keep moving. But every step felt heavier, as if the ground beneath me was pulling me back. I heard my footsteps echo, and then another sound. The rustling again. I whipped around, heart racing. I saw nothing, just the empty street behind me. But the rustling continued, growing louder, closer. I tried to calm myself, tried to remind myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the sound grew, I realized it wasn't just the rustling of leaves or the wind. It was something else. Something moving. Slowly, I backed up, my body pressed against the cold stone of a building. I was cornered. And then I saw it. In the shadow of the alley, a figure stepped forward. A man. His face was hidden in the darkness, but his silhouette was unmistakable. He was tall, unnaturally tall, standing completely still. His presence radiated something cold and uninviting. For a moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. The air between us felt thick, oppressive, like the silence before a storm. The voice in my head was louder now. "You're not alone anymore." The man took a step closer. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my heart thundering in my chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering me, and then spoke, his voice low, almost a growl. "You shouldn't have ignored it," he said, his voice strangely familiar, yet somehow off. "Now, it knows you." My breath caught in my throat. The voice in my head, was it him? Was he controlling it? Was he the one behind everything? I took a step back, panic surging through me. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, trying to hold onto some sense of control. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. His presence felt suffocating, like the air around me had turned to stone. "You already gave me what I needed," he said, and his voice echoed in my mind, merging with the whispers of the voice that had never stopped. "Now, I'll never let you go." I was shaking now, the fear clawing at my insides. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. This man, this figure, was somehow connected to the voice, connected to everything that had been happening. I wasn't crazy. This wasn't just a glitch or a prank. Something far darker was at play. The man stepped closer, the shadows swallowing him whole, until he was only a silhouette, his eyes two glowing, hollow pits of darkness. "You should have listened when I first spoke to you," the voice whispered again, coming from everywhere now, surrounding me, suffocating me. The figure reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was run. I turned and fled, my feet pounding the pavement, my mind screaming. The voice was everywhere. The man was everywhere. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I didn't care. I just had to keep moving. Had to keep running. But the voice, the figure, they weren't going to let me go. They couldn't. And deep down, I knew it. I was never going to escape. I ran through the empty streets, the cold night air biting at my skin. My heart pounded in my chest as if it wanted to break free, as if it could outrun the terror that followed me. I didn't know what I was running from, but I couldn't stop. The voice had followed me. I could hear it, faint at first, but growing clearer with every step. "You can't run forever," it whispered, low and insistent, a threat hidden in the soft words. "You can't escape yourself." I picked up the pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I needed to get away from the apartment, from everything that felt wrong. My mind raced. Where could I go? Who could help me? The streets were eerily silent. Not a single car passed by. No one was out at this hour. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something chasing me, but there was nothing. Just shadows stretching long across the pavement, reaching for me. The voice spoke again, louder this time, cutting through the silence. I've been with you your whole life. You just never listened. I stopped in my tracks, hands gripping my head as I tried to shut it out. The words echoed in my skull, vibrating through my entire body. My head throbbed with pain. I couldn't take it anymore. It felt like the voice was inside me, filling every corner of my mind, every thought. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice cracking. The streetlights flickered above me, casting harsh, jagged shadows across the pavement. What? I don't want anything from you, the voice replied, its tone too calm, too casual for what it was saying. I already have you. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. The voice was right. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it was always there, inside me. It was always watching. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. There had to be a way to stop this. A way to fight back. But what if it wasn't just a voice? What if it was something more? Something that controlled everything, the music, the technology, my thoughts? Something that had always been there, waiting for me to notice? I ran, not sure where I was going, just needing to keep moving. But every step felt heavier, as if the ground beneath me was pulling me back. I heard my footsteps echo, and then another sound. The rustling again. I whipped around, heart racing. I saw nothing, just the empty street behind me. But the rustling continued, growing louder, closer. I tried to calm myself, tried to remind myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the sound grew, I realized it wasn't just the rustling of leaves or the wind. It was something else. Something moving. Slowly, I backed up, my body pressed against the cold stone of a building. I was cornered. And then I saw it. In the shadow of the alley, a figure stepped forward. A man. His face was hidden in the darkness, but his silhouette was unmistakable. He was tall, unnaturally tall, standing completely still. His presence radiated something cold and uninviting. For a moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. The air between us felt thick, oppressive, like the silence before a storm. The voice in my head was louder now. You're not alone anymore. The man took a step closer. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my heart thundering in my chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering me, and then spoke, his voice low, almost a growl. You shouldn't have ignored it, he said, his voice strangely familiar, yet somehow off. Now, it knows you. My breath caught in my throat. The voice in my head, was it him? Was he controlling it? Was he the one behind everything? I took a step back, panic surging through me. What do you want from me? I demanded, trying to hold on to some sense of control. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. His presence felt suffocating, like the air around me had turned to stone. You already gave me what I needed, he said, and his voice echoed in my mind, merging with the whispers of the voice that had never stopped. Now, I'll never let you go. I was shaking now, the fear clawing at my insides. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. This man, this figure, was somehow connected to the voice, connected to everything that had been happening. I wasn't crazy. This wasn't just a glitch or a prank. Something far darker was at play. The man stepped closer, the shadows swallowing him whole, until he was only a silhouette, his eyes two glowing, hollow pits of darkness. You should have listened when I first spoke to you, the voice whispered again, coming from everywhere now, surrounding me, suffocating me. The figure reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was run. I turned and fled, my feet pounding the pavement, my mind screaming. The voice was everywhere. The man was everywhere. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I didn't care. I just had to keep moving. Had to keep running. But the voice, the figure, they weren't going to let me go. They couldn't. And deep down, I knew it. I was never going to escape. I ran until my legs felt like they might collapse beneath me, my breath ragged and desperate, but the voice kept following, haunting every step. It wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was inside me, creeping into my bones, twisting every thought, every action. I didn't know where I was anymore, only that I couldn't stop. The streets had long since blurred together, every corner looking the same, every shadow feeling too close. You think you're running from me? The voice whispered, now not just in my mind but in the air around me, like it was coming from the very ground beneath my feet. There's no place you can hide. I'm already there. I stumbled, barely catching myself against a street lamp. The cold, flickering light felt like the last thing keeping me grounded in reality. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of empty streets, the oppressive silence hanging in the air like a shroud. It was then I realized there was no one else. No one to help me. The whole world felt empty, as though everything, everyone, was just a part of this nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to block out the relentless voice, but it was still there, seeping through my thoughts. You've been alone this whole time. Everyone else is just a distraction. I couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me. My mind raced, trying to find some way to explain this, some rational reason. But the more I thought, the more I realized that there was no rational explanation. This wasn't just something I could walk away from. Then, without warning, the voice grew louder, filling my ears to the point of physical pain. I am you, and I will always be with you. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed by the suffocating pressure of it all. My head was spinning. My vision blurred. I couldn't escape. I couldn't think clearly anymore. Was I losing myself? Had I already lost my mind? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke through the chaos in my mind. I looked up, frantic, hoping, praying that it was someone else, someone who could help me. But what I saw wasn't a person at all. It was the figure, the man from before. Standing in the middle of the street, bathed in the pale light of the lamp above, his features still obscured by shadows. I tried to scramble back, but my body felt frozen, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears, feel the cold sweat on my skin. The man stepped forward, his movements deliberate, slow, as if savoring every moment. You're mine now, he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence. His voice was the sound of my thoughts, my fears, my deepest insecurities. I've always been with you. You just never knew how to listen. He reached out, his hand hovering just above my face. The air between us crackled with an unnatural tension. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but my body refused to obey. I felt a coldness wash over me, an icy dread that seeped into my bones. It was like he wasn't just a man. He wasn't even human. He was something else, something that had always been there, watching, waiting, controlling. The voice surged in my mind. He is me. And now, so are you. I shook my head violently, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The more I resisted, the louder the voice became. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape him. You don't have to fight, the figure said, his voice almost soothing now, like a lullaby. Just accept it. Accept that you're mine. You always have been. Tears blurred my vision as I stared at him, at this thing that had taken over my reality. I had no way out. There was no escape. He had already won. Suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The streetlights flickered, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as if the world itself was folding in on me. The man's shadow stretched unnaturally long, creeping across the pavement, swallowing everything in its path. Do you understand now? He asked, his voice a low, resonating hum. You were never in control. You've been mine all along. I closed my eyes, unable to look at him anymore. The weight of it all was too much. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. A sound broke through the haze of panic. A loud crack that echoed through the empty streets, like something heavy had fallen to the ground. I opened my eyes. The figure was gone. In his place, a dark, swirling mist filled the street, a roiling cloud of shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe. My heart raced. What was happening? Where had he gone? And then, I realized something. The voice was still there. It was everywhere. It was me. It had always been me. The mist began to thin, and the world around me shifted. The buildings, the street, the very ground beneath me seemed to warp, twisting into shapes that made no sense. The voice, now clearer than ever, whispered one final word. Welcome home. And with that, I knew I was never going to escape. Not from the voice, not from him. I had become part of it all, swallowed whole by whatever force had taken control of my life. The world was no longer real. It was just a part of the nightmare I had become. And now, there was no going back. The world had become a blur of shifting shapes and fragmented reality. I stood there, unable to make sense of the streets that no longer felt familiar. They twisted in ways that defied logic, the buildings bending and curving like they were made of rubber, warping into grotesque forms. It was as if the world itself had been turned inside out. The voice was louder now, its presence more overwhelming. It wasn't just in my mind anymore, it was in the very air I breathed. It seeped into every thought, every action, pulling at the very core of my being. There was no escape. There never had been. You're not afraid of the dark anymore, the voice whispered, its tone calm, almost approving. You've embraced it. You've become part of it. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but it was useless. The darkness was everywhere. The mist had thickened, swirling around me like a living entity, coiling up my legs and arms, wrapping around my neck like an invisible noose. I could feel it tightening, squeezing the life out of me. It felt like drowning, but without water, just pure, suffocating pressure. I gasped for air, my chest rising and falling in frantic breaths, but it didn't help. The air was thick, heavy, full of static. The voice was still there, inside me, around me, a constant hum in the back of my skull. "You've become mine," it continued, a hint of satisfaction in its tone. "You've been mine since the moment you listened." I wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but I couldn't. My body was no longer my own. The mist, the shadows, they were taking over, filling the empty spaces inside me, turning me into something else. Something I couldn't recognize. The world spun faster, the distorted buildings melting into pools of color, the streets turning into endless voids. It felt like I was falling, or maybe I was already falling and hadn't realized it. Falling into nothingness. Into the void that had swallowed everything around me. I closed my eyes again, trying to hold onto the fragments of the person I used to be. But there was nothing left. There was only the voice, only the figure, only the endless darkness. And then, in the silence that followed, a single word echoed through the fog. Free. I didn't understand it at first. Free? What did it mean? How could I be free while I was already trapped? How could there be freedom in a world where nothing was real anymore? But then, slowly, I realized it wasn't about escape. It wasn't about running or fighting. It was about acceptance. I had accepted it. The voice, the figure, the dark mist, they had become a part of me. The moment I'd listened, I had already joined them. There was no more separation, no more resistance. There was only the voice, guiding me, controlling me, becoming me. And in that moment, I understood what had happened. I was no longer a person. I was a conduit. A vessel. The figure wasn't a man at all. He was the embodiment of the voice, the force that had always been there, manipulating reality, warping perception. I opened my eyes, and the world around me stopped shifting. The buildings were now solid, but they were strange, unfamiliar, like they were built from a different world. The streets stretched out before me, but they didn't lead anywhere. They were endless, looping, a maze with no way out. And then, I realized I didn't need to escape anymore. This was where I belonged. The voice wasn't an enemy. It was a part of me. I turned and looked back, half expecting to see the figure, the man, but there was no one there. The mist had vanished. The world was silent now, unearthingly so. But I wasn't alone. The voice whispered again, calm, soothing. "Welcome home," it said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel afraid. I was home. Have you ever walked into a place that felt wrong, as if the air itself held its breath? For me, it was the staircase on the 7th floor. I never thought much about it until that night. The lights in the stairwell had been broken for weeks, and nobody seemed to care enough to fix them. A neighbor once joked about it, saying it was just the building's way of saving on electricity. But deep down, I felt something else, a quiet unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind every time I passed through. I lived alone, a small one-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor. It wasn't much, but it was home. My job kept me busy most of the day, and the evenings were mine to spend in peace. At least, they used to be. That night, I came home later than usual. The elevator was out of service, again. I sighed, gripping the straps of my bag, and pushed open the door to the stairwell. The dim glow of the emergency exit sign barely lit the way. I hesitated at the base of the stairs, staring up into the void where the 7th-floor landing should have been. It was pitch black. The usual hum of the building felt different. Quieter. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights on the lower floors barely reached me. Even the sounds of traffic from outside seemed muffled. I swallowed hard and began my ascent, each step creaking underfoot. By the time I reached the 6th floor, my heart was racing. Not from exertion, but from the heavy silence that surrounded me. The 7th floor loomed ahead, a black chasm that swallowed the stairwell whole. My phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam trembling as my hand shook. I took the first step onto the 7th floor landing, and that's when I heard it, a faint, shuffling noise. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence, it was deafening. I froze, the light from my phone darting across the walls, searching for the source. Nothing moved. Hello? My voice echoed up the stairwell, weak and uncertain. The shuffling stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a draft or an animal that had found its way inside. But as I took another step, the noise started again. This time, it was closer. I held my breath and shone the light down the corridor. The beam flickered for a moment before steadying. My pulse pounded in my ears as I caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the light. A shadow moved, or maybe it didn't. It was hard to tell. The darkness played tricks on my eyes. Just the wind, I whispered to myself. Just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I hurried up the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted toward the 8th floor. I didn't stop until I slammed the door to my apartment behind me, bolting it shut. My hand shook as I locked the chain and leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The silence inside my apartment felt comforting at first, but then I noticed something strange. It wasn't completely silent. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from the walls, almost like footsteps. I turned toward the window, my heart sinking as I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the hallway. I stood frozen by the door, straining to hear the sound. The tapping was faint but steady, growing louder as it neared. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my ear to the wood, hoping, no, praying it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one sending a tremor of dread through my body. I clenched my fists, trying to decide what to do. Should I open the door? Call for help? My phone was still in my hand, but the thought of speaking to anyone felt distant, almost impossible. The footsteps stopped just outside my apartment. Who's there? My voice was a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. No response. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a new sound pierced the silence, a soft scratching, like nails dragging along the door. It moved slowly, tracing a path from the bottom of the frame to the lock. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound stopped abruptly. I stared at the door, my eyes wide and unblinking, as the silence stretched on. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, I couldn't tell. The air felt thick, heavy with a tension I couldn't explain. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the scratching started again. This time, it was more insistent, almost frantic. My chest tightened as I backed away, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it an animal? A prank? Or something far worse? Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small barrier against whatever was out there. I retreated to the far corner of the room, my eyes never leaving the door. The scratching stopped once more, and the silence returned. I waited, my muscles tense and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But the door remained still. Finally, I allowed myself to breathe. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever it was had left. But then I heard it again, the shuffling sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was inside the apartment. The shuffling sound was faint, but it was there. Inside. With me. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath caught in my chest. My eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. The faint glow from the streetlights outside cast long, distorted silhouettes across the walls, making everything seem alive. The sound came again, a dragging, scraping noise, like something being pulled across the floor. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It echoed softly, bouncing off the walls and mixing with the pounding of my heart. I grabbed the nearest object within reach, a heavy ceramic vase, and held it tightly. My knuckles turned white as I gripped it, waiting for the noise to stop, or for something to reveal itself. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. No response. I inched toward the light switch, the vase shaking in my hands. Every step felt like an eternity, the sound of my own movements amplifying the oppressive silence around me. When I finally reached the switch, I flipped it on. Nothing happened. The bulb remained dark, as if the light itself had abandoned me. I stared at it for a moment, my mind grasping for an explanation. A power outage? No, the fridge was still humming softly in the kitchen. Then I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall, slow and deliberate. It wasn't from me. I wasn't moving. My chest tightened as the shadow shifted, its edges flickering unnaturally, as though it didn't belong to this world. I stepped back, clutching the vase so tightly I thought it might shatter. My foot hit something solid, and I stumbled, nearly falling. When I turned to see what it was, my blood ran cold. My phone, which I had dropped earlier, was now on the opposite side of the room. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the direction of the kitchen. The shadow on the wall stretched and twisted, as if it were dragging itself across the room toward me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were anchored to the floor. All I could do was watch as the darkness seemed to gather, coalescing into a shape, a tall, thin figure with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It stopped just outside the faint glow of the window, lingering in the shadows. I could see its outline now, impossibly dark and solid, as if it was absorbing all the light around it. It tilted its head, and though I couldn't see a face, I felt its gaze on me. The vase slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. The sound broke whatever spell had held me in place, and I bolted for the door. My fingers fumbled with the chain and lock as I heard the thing move behind me, faster now, its steps heavy and erratic. I threw the door open and ran into the hallway, not daring to look back. The stairwell was still dark, but I didn't care. I hurtled down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time, the sound of my own panic breathing drowning out everything else. When I reached the ground floor, I burst through the door into the night. The cool air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was a block away, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a 24-hour convenience store. Only then did I turn around. The entrance to my building was dark and still, as if nothing had happened. But in one of the windows, high above, a shadow moved. It wasn't mine. I stood under the fluorescent lights of the convenience store, gasping for breath. The clerk behind the counter glanced at me, puzzled but uninterested. My mind raced, replaying the events over and over. What had I seen? What was that thing? The shadow in the window haunted me. It moved with purpose, as though it had been watching, waiting. But for what? And why me? I couldn't go back to the apartment. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But I needed answers. I pulled out my phone, its screen cracked from the fall earlier. The battery was low, but I didn't care. I searched for anything that might explain what had happened, urban legends, ghost stories, anything. Haunted stairwells, I muttered to myself as I typed. The search results flooded the screen. Most were just stories, forums, amateur blogs, and videos claiming paranormal encounters. But one post caught my attention. The seventh floor phenomenon, a portal to the unknown? The title felt like a punch to the gut. I tapped on the link. The article described eerily similar experiences, dark stairwells, broken lights, and strange figures seen only in shadows. The accounts varied, but one detail was consistent. It always happened on the seventh floor. My blood ran cold as I scrolled down. One entry, written months ago, described my building. I lived there for a year before I moved out. It started with the lights. They'd flicker, then go out completely. At first, I thought it was just bad wiring. But then I started hearing things, footsteps, whispers. And the shadows. I'll never forget the shadows. They're not natural. If you live there, leave. Don't try to understand it. Just go. My hands shook as I read the words. Someone else had experienced this. Someone else had seen the shadows. I scrolled further, desperate for more. Another entry mentioned the origin of these phenomena, a theory about places where reality is thin, where something from beyond our understanding can bleed through. The seventh floor, it said, might be one of those places. Whatever you do, the post concluded, don't acknowledge it. Don't let it know you see it. If you do, it won't stop. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I thought back to that moment in the stairwell when I called out. Had I already broken that rule? A sudden noise pulled me from my thoughts. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the store's refrigerators. A soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. At first, I saw nothing. Just the clerk behind the counter, staring at his phone. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. My eyes darted to the glass doors leading outside. In the reflection, I saw it. A shadow, tall and twisted, standing just beyond the light of the store. It was still, but I knew it was watching. Waiting. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a rack of chips. The clerk looked up, startled. You okay, man? He asked. I pointed to the doors, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I need to get out of here, I stammered, my voice barely audible. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the store. The street was empty, eerily quiet. My footsteps echoed as I ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. But as I turned a corner, I froze. There it was. Standing in the middle of the street, illuminated by a flickering street lamp. Its head tilted, its shadowy form twisting unnaturally. It had followed me. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling with every step. The shadow stood under the flickering street lamp, its edges undulating like smoke trapped in a jar. It didn't move, but I could feel it, its presence pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. I turned and ran. My breath came in sharp, panic gasps as I darted down alleyways and side streets, hoping to lose it. The city around me felt unfamiliar, distorted. Every corner I turned seemed darker, the streetlights dimmer. But no matter how far I ran, I could feel it behind me. Not the sound of footsteps, not a presence I could see, just the undeniable sense that I was being followed. I rounded another corner and stumbled into a small park. The space was empty, the trees casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. I collapsed onto a bench, clutching my chest, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from the far end of the park, I heard it, the shuffling sound. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. I stood, my legs weak and unsteady. My eyes darted to the shadows between the trees, searching for movement. At first, there was nothing. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But then I saw it. The shadow emerged from the darkness, its form twisting and contorting as it moved toward me. This time, it wasn't silent. A low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a whisper, seemed to emanate from its form. "Stay back." I shouted, but my voice cracked with fear. It didn't stop. My mind raced. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. The article's warning echoed in my head, "Don't let it know you see it." But it was too late for that. It had followed me because I'd acknowledged it. I'd broken the rule. The shadow was closer now, its form towering over me. My body froze, paralyzed by fear. Its head tilted again, as if studying me, and then it did something I'll never forget. It spoke. The voice was fractured, as though coming from multiple mouths at once. The words were unintelligible at first, a jumbled mess of sounds. But then, amidst the chaos, I heard one clear word. "Stay." My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The shadow loomed over me, its presence crushing, suffocating. And then it reached out. A tendril of darkness extended from its form, curling toward me like smoke. As it touched my chest, a cold unlike anything I ever felt seeped into my skin. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into black. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the stairwell on the 7th floor of my building. The lights were still out, the air heavy with silence. My phone was in my hand, the screen cracked but still functional. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I stood, I felt it, an ache deep in my chest, as though something had been taken from me. I moved to the window at the end of the hallway and looked out. The city was waking up, the sun rising in the distance. Everything seemed normal. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. Behind me, in the shadows, something moved. And I knew it wasn't over. Have you ever seen someone who looks exactly like you? Not just a resemblance, but a perfect, uncanny mirror image? It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed her. I'd taken refuge in a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and the comforting smell of fresh coffee. I came here often, drawn by its cozy atmosphere and the promise of solitude. The cafe was quiet, save for the low hum of conversations and the occasional clatter of cups. I sat near the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. My latte steamed gently in front of me, untouched. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a reflection in the glass. She sat at a table near the back, partially hidden by a potted plant. Her posture was identical to mine, legs crossed, one hand resting on the table, the other holding a phone. She even wore the same coat as me, a dark green one with a frayed cuff I hadn't bothered to fix. I blinked, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a reflection. She looked up, and our eyes met. It felt like staring into a distorted mirror. Her face was mine, but her expression was wrong. Cold. Detached. I turned away, my heart pounding. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. A doppelganger? Someone playing an elaborate prank? But how could someone replicate every detail, my haircut, my earrings, even the small scar on my left eyebrow? I risked another glance, hoping she would be gone. She wasn't. Instead, she was looking directly at me, her gaze unwavering. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up a pen from the table and began to write something on a napkin. When she was done, she stood, leaving the napkin behind. Without another glance, she walked toward the door. The bell above it jingled softly as she stepped out into the rain. I sat frozen for a moment, debating whether to follow her. My curiosity won. I hurried to her table, my legs trembling as I approached. The napkin lay folded neatly in the center of the table. I picked it up, unfolding it with shaky hands. The message was simple, scrawled in handwriting identical to mine. Do not come back. My breath caught. The cafe seemed to blur around me, the sounds of conversation fading into a dull buzz. I turned the napkin over, looking for more, but it was blank. I rushed to the door and stepped outside, scanning the street for any sign of her. The rain had picked up, and the sidewalk was empty except for a man rushing past with an umbrella. She was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the napkin clutched in my hand. The rain soaked through my coat, but I didn't care. My mind raced with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Who was she? How could she look exactly like me? And why did she leave that message? The answers, I feared, would not bring comfort. I couldn't shake the encounter. The napkin, now damp from the rain, was folded tightly in my pocket as I walked home. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but the journey felt endless. Every shadow seemed to shift, every stranger's glance lingered too long. By the time I reached my door, my hands were trembling. I fumbled with my keys, finally managing to unlock the door and slip inside. The familiar surroundings of my living room did little to calm my nerves. I dropped my bag on the floor and pulled out the napkin, smoothing it on the kitchen counter. The message stared back at me, stark and unyielding, do not come back. Who was she? Was she trying to warn me? Threaten me? I turned on every light in the apartment, as though the brightness could banish the unease curling in my chest. Sitting down at my desk, I opened my laptop and began searching. Doppelganger. The results were a strange mix of folklore, psychology, and superstition. Stories of people meeting their doubles, often accompanied by tragedy or death. In some cultures, a doppelganger was seen as an omen, a harbinger of misfortune. But none of it explained what had happened today. None of it answered the question burning in my mind, why me? I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the woman was just someone who happened to look like me, and I was letting my imagination run wild. But then there was the handwriting. I pulled out a notebook and scribbled a few words, comparing them to the napkin's message. The similarities were undeniable. It was my handwriting, down to the slight slant of the letters and the way I looped my OS. The air in the apartment felt heavy, suffocating. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in a damp haze. The streets below glistened under the dim glow of streetlights. Have you ever seen someone who looks exactly like you? Not just a resemblance, but a perfect, uncanny mirror image? It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed her. I'd taken refuge in a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and the comforting smell of fresh coffee. I came here often, drawn by its cozy atmosphere and the promise of solitude. The cafe was quiet, save for the low hum of conversations and the occasional clatter of cups. I sat near the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. My latte steamed gently in front of me, untouched. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a reflection in the glass. She sat at a table near the back, partially hidden by a potted plant. Her posture was identical to mine, legs crossed, one hand resting on the table, the other holding a phone. She even wore the same coat as me, a dark green one with a frayed cuff I hadn't bothered to fix. I blinked, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a reflection. She looked up, and our eyes met. It felt like staring into a distorted mirror. Her face was mine, but her expression was wrong. Cold. Detached. I turned away, my heart pounding. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. A doppelganger? Someone playing an elaborate prank? But how could someone replicate every detail, my haircut, my earrings, even the small scar on my left eyebrow? I risked another glance, hoping she would be gone. She wasn't. Instead, she was looking directly at me, her gaze unwavering. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up a pen from the table and began to write something on a napkin. When she was done, she stood, leaving the napkin behind. Without another glance, she walked toward the door. The bell above it jingled softly as she stepped out into the rain. I sat frozen for a moment, debating whether to follow her. My curiosity won. I hurried to her table, my legs trembling as I approached. The napkin lay folded neatly in the center of the table. I picked it up, unfolding it with shaky hands. The message was simple, scrawled in handwriting identical to mine. Do not come back. My breath caught. The cafe seemed to blur around me, the sounds of conversation fading into a dull buzz. I turned the napkin over, looking for more, but it was blank. I rushed to the door and stepped outside, scanning the street for any sign of her. The rain had picked up, and the sidewalk was empty except for a man rushing past with an umbrella. She was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the napkin clutched in my hand. The rain soaked through my coat, but I didn't care. My mind raced with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Who was she? How could she look exactly like me? And why did she leave that message? The answers, I feared, would not bring comfort. I couldn't shake the encounter. The napkin, now damp from the rain, was folded tightly in my pocket as I walked home. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but the journey felt endless. Every shadow seemed to shift, every stranger's glance lingered too long. By the time I reached my door, my hands were trembling. I fumbled with my keys, finally managing to unlock the door and slip inside. The familiar surroundings of my living room did little to calm my nerves. I dropped my bag on the floor and pulled out the napkin, smoothing it on the kitchen counter. The message stared back at me, stark and unyielding, "Do not come back." Who was she? Was she trying to warn me? Threaten me? I turned on every light in the apartment, as though the brightness could banish the unease curling in my chest. Sitting down at my desk, I opened my laptop and began searching. Doppelganger. The results were a strange mix of folklore, psychology, and superstition. Stories of people meeting their doubles, often accompanied by tragedy or death. In some cultures, a doppelganger was seen as an omen, a harbinger of misfortune. But none of it explained what had happened today. None of it answered the question burning in my mind: why me? I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the woman was just someone who happened to look like me, and I was letting my imagination run wild. But then there was the handwriting. I pulled out a notebook and scribbled a few words, comparing them to the napkin's message. The similarities were undeniable. It was my handwriting, down to the slight slant of the letters and the way I looped my OS. The air in the apartment felt heavy, suffocating. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in a damp haze. The streets below glistened under the dim glow of streetlights. And then I saw her. She stood across the street, half hidden in the shadows. Her face was tilted upward, looking directly at me. Even from this distance, I could see it, the same features, the same expressionless stare. A cold wave of fear washed over me. She didn't move, didn't make any attempt to approach. She just stood there, watching. I stumbled back inside, slamming the balcony door shut. My heart raced as I drew the curtains, sealing myself in. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the napkin on the table in front of me, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the hours dragged by in silence. When morning came, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt like a relief. I dared to peek outside, half expecting her to still be there. But the street was empty. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened yesterday was some bizarre fluke. Still, as I got ready for work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal. And yet, for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure it was really me. The day passed in a haze. At work, I struggled to focus. My colleagues' voices seemed distant, their words a blur. Every time I glanced at my computer screen, I caught my reflection in its glossy surface. It unnerved me in a way it never had before. By the time I returned home, the late afternoon sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. My apartment felt eerily quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I decided to distract myself. A hot shower, a mindless TV show, anything to keep my thoughts from circling back to her. But as I stood under the stream of water, letting it wash away the tension of the day, I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible. Whispering. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from the bathroom. It was just outside the door. My mind raced. It had to be my imagination. The water running, the hum of the pipes, nothing more. I turned off the shower, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder. I stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around myself. My reflection in the steamed-up mirror caught my eye, and for a moment I swore it moved before I did. The whispering stopped. I stood there, dripping water onto the tiled floor, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I opened the bathroom door, peeking out into the hallway. Nothing. The apartment was as I'd left it, every light on, the living room bathed in a warm glow. I stepped into the hallway, clutching the towel tightly around me. That's when I saw it. On the kitchen counter, where the napkin had been, there was something new. A second napkin, folded neatly next to the first. I hadn't left it there. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. The handwriting was the same, mine. She is watching. The room spun, my grip on the napkin faltering. I backed away, my eyes darting to the balcony door. The curtains were drawn, but I could feel it, something just beyond them. I grabbed my phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. A friend, a neighbor, anyone. But the call wouldn't connect. The line crackled, a faint static filling my ear before cutting off completely. A soft knock echoed through the apartment. It came from the balcony door. My legs refused to move. I stared at the curtains, willing myself to stay calm. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice shaking. Silence. Gathering what little courage I had, I crept toward the balcony. My hand hovered over the curtain, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard outside. I yanked the curtain aside. The balcony was empty. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I turned back to the living room, my blood ran cold. She was standing there. In the middle of my apartment, her head tilted slightly, the same blank expression on her face. For a moment, neither of us moved. It felt like the air between us had thickened, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was mine, but hollow, devoid of emotion. "Stop looking for me." I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Before I could process what was happening, she stepped backward, fading into the shadows of the hallway. And then she was gone. The apartment was silent again, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. I clutched the napkin in my hand, its edges crumpled and damp. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing, the napkins spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. One thought consumed me. If she was me, then what did that make me? By the time the sun rose, I was no closer to understanding what was happening. My reflection, my double, my whatever she was, had shattered any sense of normalcy in my life. I stared at the two napkins on the table, their messages echoing in my mind. "Do not come back. She is watching." I couldn't stay here. The apartment felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. Grabbing my coat, I decided to leave, no destination in mind, just anywhere but here. The streets were quieter than usual, the city shrouded in a gray morning mist. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts circling the same unanswerable questions. Who was she? Why did she warn me? And why was I seeing her now? Lost in thought, I found myself standing in front of the cafe. The place where it all began. I hesitated, the memory of her sitting at that back table flooding my mind. Her cold stare, her deliberate movements. The napkin. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The cafe was empty, save for the barista behind the counter. The faint aroma of coffee and baked goods filled the air, deceptively comforting. I sat at the same table as before, near the window. The chair across from me, where she had sat, was empty. I ordered a coffee, though I wasn't sure I'd drink it. My hands rested on the table, fingers tracing invisible patterns on its worn surface. Back so soon? The barista's voice startled me. I looked up, confused. What? She smiled politely. You were just here yesterday, weren't you? I thought I saw you leave something on that table. She nodded toward the spot where the napkin had been. My blood ran cold. Yesterday? Yes. Same coat, same scarf. I couldn't respond. My thoughts spiraled as I tried to piece together what she'd said. If the barista had seen me, or thought she had, then was she seeing her? I stood abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. The barista looked startled, but I couldn't stay to explain. I hurried out of the cafe, the bell above the door jangling as I pushed into the misty street. I needed answers. I found myself at the library, poring over books and articles on folklore, psychology, anything that might explain what was happening to me. Most of it was useless, stories of doppelgangers as omens of death, case studies of people experiencing psychotic breaks. One passage caught my attention. The appearance of a double often signifies unresolved inner conflict. Whether a manifestation of guilt, fear, or denial, the doppelganger forces the individual to confront what they have buried deep within. Unresolved conflict. The word struck a chord, though I couldn't say why. My life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. Ordinary. There wasn't anything I was hiding from, or so I thought. As I left the library, dusk was settling over the city. The streets were quieter now, the mist thickening into a fog. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again. When I reached my apartment building, the stairwell was eerily silent. The usual hum of neighbors' voices and muffled televisions was absent. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, the familiar space feeling foreign and wrong. On the kitchen counter, there was a third napkin. This time, the message was different. You can't run. I staggered back, nearly dropping my bag. The air in the room seemed to pulse, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. Why are you doing this? I shouted, my voice breaking. The silence answered. And then I saw it. In the hallway mirror, her reflection stood behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my throat. When I turned back to the mirror, she was still there, staring at me with that same cold detachment. This time, she spoke without moving her lips, her voice echoing in my mind. It's your turn to know the truth. The mirror cracked. The crack in the mirror was small at first, a thin line running down the center. But as I stared at it, the line spread, splintering across the glass like a spider web. The reflection of my own face began to warp, twisting unnaturally, like something that didn't belong. I reached out, my hand trembling, but before I could touch the glass, the mirror shattered with a sound like glass shattering in slow motion. And there, in the fractured shards, I saw her. She was standing in the hallway, her face the same as mine but not mine, hollow, empty, her eyes unblinking. My breath caught in my throat as the pieces of the mirror continued to fall to the floor, each shard revealing more of her, more of that cold, lifeless version of me. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Yet here she was, staring back at me, as if she were waiting for something, as if she were waiting for me to finally understand. I stumbled back into the living room, my legs weak, my chest tightening. My apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in on me as I tried to make sense of the scene before me. "You," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Who are you?" The figure in the shards didn't speak, but I could feel her presence growing stronger, her gaze more insistent, more suffocating. I turned toward the table, where the napkins were scattered. 3 of them now, each with their cryptic message. "Do not come back. She is watching. You can't run." But this time, there was something different, something more, something I hadn't seen before. I picked up the last napkin, the one with the final message. It wasn't just the words anymore. On the paper, in faded ink, was a sketch. It was of me. Of us. A mirror image. But the drawing wasn't exact. There was something wrong with it, something I couldn't put my finger on. The eyes in the sketch were dark, hollow, like hers. And the figure was standing in front of the same mirror, the reflection not quite matching. I dropped the napkin, my heart racing. I started, but the words stuck in my throat. I turned back to the shattered mirror. There was a deeper understanding now, one that filled me with a paralyzing dread. This wasn't some strange coincidence. This wasn't just a game. I had seen the reflection. She was me. Or rather, she was everything I feared. The truth was unbearable. I had been running from her. Running from myself. I had spent my life avoiding the things I didn't want to confront, the guilt, the fear, the dark parts of my soul that I had buried deep. I thought I could outrun them. But now, here she was, my reflection come to life, dragging everything I had tried to ignore into the light. And now, there was no escaping it. As I stared at the shattered mirror, I realized the truth wasn't just in the reflection. The truth was that I had always known her. She was the parts of me I had refused to face. She was the darkness in my own heart, and she was here to make me see. I took a deep breath, the air heavy in my lungs. The apartment felt cold, too cold, and the walls seemed to press in, suffocating me. But I couldn't look away from her eyes, my own eyes, staring back at me from the broken shards. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn to see who it was. I already knew. But when I heard the soft whisper, "It's time to go," I knew I had no choice but to follow. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stepped into the darkness. The last thing I heard was the soft sound of glass crunching beneath my feet. And then, nothing. I've always wondered what it would be like to see the future. To know what's coming, to be prepared, to have the upper hand in everything life throws at you. But what if knowing the future wasn't a blessing? What if it was a curse? I found the camera on an old shelf in my uncle's attic. He was a bit of a hoarder, the kind of person who kept everything, from old books to outdated technology. It was one of those late afternoon moments when the sunlight shone weakly through the dusty windows. I had been searching for something to pass the time when my fingers brushed against the lens of a strange camera. It looked old, nothing special at first. The leather strap was cracked, and the black body of the camera was covered in dust. But when I picked it up, I felt an odd sensation, like a jolt of energy running through my fingertips. Curiosity got the better of me, and I dusted it off. The camera seemed heavy, as if it had a secret weight to it. There was no brand name, no identifying markings, just a small dial with numbers on the side. I turned it on, and the lens flashed once, briefly. My heart skipped a beat. I don't know why I felt so uneasy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was holding something important, something I shouldn't have found. I put the camera down, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I should have left it there, forgotten about it. But I didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing with thoughts of the camera. What if it worked? What if it could show me the future? I retrieved it from the attic and studied it again. The camera looked ordinary, but something about it felt different. I took it with me to my room and decided to give it a try. The dial had numbers on it, 1, 2, 3, and so on. I turned the dial to 1 and snapped a picture. The camera whirred, and I could hear the faint sound of the film moving inside. It was strange. The camera didn't make any sense. I didn't expect it to work. I waited for the picture to develop, the anticipation making my heart race. The picture slowly emerged from the camera, and my breath caught in my throat. It was of my room. Of this very room. But there was someone in it. A person I didn't recognize, standing by the window. I stared at the photo, my heart pounding in my chest. The room looked exactly like it did now, except for the stranger. Who was this person? How could this be possible? I didn't know what to do. I felt a chill spread through my body as I thought about the implications. What did this mean? Was it a trick? Did the camera somehow capture something from my future? I flipped through the camera's settings, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just a regular, old-fashioned camera. But this was no ordinary photo. I tried to shake the unease, but it lingered. The image of that stranger in my room. I decided to test it again. Maybe it was just a fluke. I turned the dial to 2 and took another picture. The whir of the film, the same process. I waited for the picture to develop, my hands shaking. When it finally appeared, my heart skipped a beat again. It was a picture of my room, just like before. But this time, the stranger was closer. The figure was standing at my desk, staring directly at me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. How could this be? This was impossible. I hadn't seen anyone enter the room. The door had been locked. There was no way anyone could have been here. The figure in the photo looked almost real. Its features were blurry, but its presence was undeniable. It was as if the camera had captured something alive in the image. I felt an overwhelming urge to get rid of the camera, to throw it away and forget everything that had happened. But part of me needed to know more. I had to know what the next picture would show. I turned the dial to 3 and took another shot. The camera whirred again. I held my breath, waiting for the image to appear. When the picture emerged, I gasped. This time, the stranger was standing right next to me. Its face was clearer now, its eyes dark, hollow, unblinking. The expression on its face, my face, was one of cold detachment. I froze. My body refused to move. The figure wasn't just in my room, it was standing in front of me, inches away, as though it was waiting for something. And then, the camera clicked again. I snapped back to reality. My heart hammered in my chest. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. The stranger in the photo wasn't just a figment of imagination, it was becoming real. I turned around, expecting to see it standing in my room, but no one was there. The silence felt heavier than ever. But I knew something was wrong. I had to stop this. I dropped the camera on the bed and rushed to lock the door. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew I had to figure it out. The stranger wasn't just a person, it was a warning. But from whom? And why? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I had no choice but to keep going, to find out who this person was. I had to face whatever was coming. The camera lay there on the bed, still humming softly, as if inviting me to take another picture. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. Who was that figure? Why did it look like me? And why did I feel so drawn to the camera, despite the terror it brought with it? I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it was impossible. The image of that stranger, my stranger, was burned into my mind. I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. I had to figure out how this camera worked and why it was showing me these impossible glimpses of the future. With trembling hands, I picked it up again. The dial was still set to 3, and I was reluctant to move it. But there was a part of me that needed to see what would happen next. The curiosity gnawed at me like a constant itch. I turned the dial to 4. A deep breath. The whirring sound filled the air, and the camera clicked. I felt my pulse quicken as I waited for the photo to develop. I couldn't help but feel like I was tempting fate by continuing this. But I couldn't stop. The picture slowly appeared before my eyes. It was of my room, just like the others. But this time, the air felt heavier. The walls seemed to press in closer. There was a sense of dread that filled every corner of the room. And there, standing by the window, was the stranger again. But this time, it was different. The figure was not alone. There was someone else in the room, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A tall man, with a blank expression, stood behind the figure. His eyes were wide open, his mouth slightly agape. But what caught my attention more than his features was the way he was staring at the camera, directly at me. He wasn't looking at the person in the room. He was looking at me. A shiver ran down my spine. It felt like he could see me through the lens. His eyes were full of something I couldn't understand, recognition. Like he knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. My stomach churned. The air felt thicker now, as if the walls were closing in around me. The weight of the camera in my hands suddenly felt unbearable. I needed to get out of there. I needed to run. But as I looked at the photo again, the figure, the other me, wasn't just standing by the window anymore. She was closer. Much closer. She was standing in front of me, the same cold, lifeless expression in her eyes. I dropped the camera. I couldn't breathe. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Sweat beaded on my forehead, my heart racing. I was drowning in fear, and I couldn't escape it. I stared at the photo again, my body shaking with terror. The man's eyes followed me, still fixed on me from the photo. The air felt too still, too quiet. I couldn't look away. I had to understand what was happening. I had to understand why it felt like the world was slipping away from me, piece by piece. I picked up the camera again, this time with more hesitation. The lens still glimmered as though beckoning me to take another picture, to see more. But what if it wasn't just showing me the future anymore? What if it was pulling me into it? What if every picture I took, every moment I captured, brought me one step closer to the strange, dark world in the photos? But there was no turning back now. I had already seen things I couldn't unsee. I set the dial to 5. The camera clicked again, the sound echoing in the silence of my room. The tension in the air seemed to heighten, each second stretching longer than the last. I stood there, frozen, waiting for the photo to develop. But as I stared at the image, my blood ran cold. The photo was of the door to my room, and the handle was turning. It was as if someone on the other side was trying to get in. The stranger, the version of me, was standing right in front of it, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. I blinked. My heart pounded louder in my ears. The photo was of the exact moment I was living in. It had captured the present. A realization hit me, sharp and unsettling. The camera didn't just capture the future, it captured the moment before something happened. It was recording events that hadn't occurred yet but were just about to. And it was showing me, or some twisted version of me, standing at the center of it all. I felt the presence of someone, or something, just beyond the door. The doorknob rattled. My pulse quickened. I couldn't breathe. Was this the moment? The moment where the stranger from the photos would step into my world? Was this the moment I would meet them face to face? I swallowed hard, gripping the camera with trembling hands. The photos had shown me everything so far, but they had only raised more questions. Who was the man in the picture? Why was he watching me? Why did the other version of me seem so cold? The door handle rattled again, and my thoughts were interrupted by a soft, sharp knock. It echoed through the room, loud and clear. Thump. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was on the other side. The knock echoed again, this time louder, sharper. My hand gripped the camera tighter, knuckles white with the force. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the steady rhythm of fear that filled the room. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time, the quiet, the fear, the overwhelming sensation that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. Another knock. This time, it was more urgent, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was there. Knew I was listening. I stood frozen, staring at the door. It was just a door. Just a simple wooden barrier between me and whatever lay beyond. But in that moment, it felt like the door was alive, like it was breathing, like it had its own pulse. The knock seemed to reverberate through the walls, shaking the room around me. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything, but my feet were glued to the floor, my mind racing in every direction, trying to make sense of it all. The camera, the photos, the stranger, it was all too much. But the knocking didn't stop. Thump, thump, thump. It grew louder with each second, as if the person, or thing, on the other side was growing more desperate. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I needed to do something. I couldn't just stand there and wait for the inevitable to happen. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. As soon as my fingers brushed the cool metal, a shiver ran down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had never been this afraid in my life. I pulled my hand away, the camera clutched tightly in my grip. The photos were a warning, weren't they? The version of me, the stranger, the man, it was all leading to this moment. Was opening the door what the camera wanted me to do? Was that how the story would unfold? I glanced back at the photo I had just taken, the one with the handle turning. The stranger was standing right there, waiting for me to make my move. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't open that door. Not yet. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was eerily still. I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps. No breath. just the pounding of my own heart. I was paralyzed with fear, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, there was a sound. A faint rustling, just beyond the door. A shuffle of footsteps, the soft scrape of something being dragged across the floor. It was subtle, but it was there. My breath hitched in my throat. Someone, or something, was moving on the other side. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know who, or what, it was. I pressed my ear against the door, holding my breath as I strained to hear. The sound was getting closer, closer to me. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. It was almost like the person was right there, just inches away. I turned the camera on, almost instinctively. The flash went off, filling the room with a blinding light. For a moment, I couldn't see anything. But when the light faded and my vision cleared, I saw it. The room was different. It wasn't my room anymore. It was a version of my room, but twisted, distorted. The walls were darker, shadows creeping along the floor like fingers stretching out toward me. The furniture was askew, the air thick with a sense of dread. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the stranger. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was someone else with her, a tall figure, wearing a black coat that hung loosely around their frame. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. I felt their presence more than I saw it. I didn't need to see their face to know they weren't human. My breath caught in my throat. The room felt colder, the air heavy with something ancient, something that didn't belong. The stranger, the version of me, was staring directly at the camera. Her expression was blank, almost as if she were waiting for me to react. She didn't speak, but her eyes, they said everything. She was telling me to come closer. The figure in the black coat moved slightly, as if shifting, as if becoming aware of my presence. I couldn't take my eyes off the photo. The figure wasn't just a shadow in the corner anymore. It was closer, closer than I was ready for. The camera shook in my hands as the real world around me seemed to blur. My heart raced. My body trembled. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this twisted version of my room with that thing staring at me, with the weight of the photos pulling me deeper into this nightmare. I turned away from the photo. The knocking at the door had started again. I had no choice. I had to open the door. But when I reached for the handle, I froze. The door wasn't there. It had vanished. In its place was the figure, the dark shadow standing in the doorway. Its face was still hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me. And I knew. I had crossed a line. My hand hovered in the space where the door had once been, the cold air pressing against my skin. There was nothing but empty space where the door should have been. No wood. No handle. Just an infinite stretch of darkness that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the room. The shadows seemed to deepen and spread, like a living thing, curling and twisting around the edges of the walls. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure was still there, standing just beyond the threshold. But now, it wasn't just an outline of darkness, it was something more. It had mass. It had form. The shadows that enveloped it seemed to writhe, constantly shifting like a nightmare that couldn't decide on its shape. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted. My pulse echoed in my ears, drowning out the world around me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape. But the air in the room was thick, like I was drowning in it. Every step forward felt impossible, as though the very floor beneath me was trying to hold me in place, to prevent me from moving. The figure shifted, and its presence seemed to expand, filling the doorway. I could feel its gaze on me, its eyes not just watching but piercing through me, seeing parts of me that I wasn't sure I even knew existed. I could feel it deep in my bones. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. Was this a dream? A nightmare? How could this be real? Then there was a sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of movement, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. It was coming from the shadows, from the figure standing before me. My eyes darted between the dark shape and the space where the door had once been. A voice, low, distorted, seeped into my ears, cold and almost too quiet to make sense of. You knew this would happen. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The voice echoed in my head, reverberating with a deep, guttural tone. I staggered back, my legs barely holding me up. The room was shrinking. The walls seemed to press in, suffocating me. The shadows wrapped themselves around me, tightening until I could barely breathe. I had to get out. I had to get out of here. The camera. I glanced to the side, where the camera had fallen. The lens caught the dim light in the room, reflecting it back in a harsh, unnatural gleam. I crawled toward it, my hand shaking as I reached for it. It was the only thing that felt like it could anchor me to reality, the only thing that hadn't changed, that hadn't warped into something unrecognizable. The camera. I raised it to my face, my hands trembling as I turned the dial to the next setting, 6. I didn't know what I was hoping for anymore. Maybe I was hoping the camera would show me a way out. Maybe I was hoping it would tell me what to do next. I snapped the picture. The camera whirred, the shutter clicking with its familiar, mechanical sound. But it wasn't the photo that sent me reeling. It was the sound that followed. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the room. The walls buckled. The shadows flared up around me, growing, twisting, and shifting. I could hear the muffled thud of footsteps, as though something was moving in time with me, always a step behind. I looked at the photo in my hands. And there it was. The room, or what was left of it, had completely changed. The walls were cracked, the floor was splintered, and in the center of the room stood the figure. But now, it wasn't just the figure. It had company. Surrounding it were dozens of other dark shapes, all facing the camera, all staring at me. Their eyes were glowing, bright, burning with an unnatural light. I dropped the camera. The air thickened once more, suffocating me, pressing in on all sides. I stumbled to my feet, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I needed to escape. I had to escape. I turned to run, but the shadows were faster than I was. They surged forward, enveloping me in an instant, dragging me back toward the center of the room, back toward the figure. You can't run from yourself, the voice whispered again, distorted and guttural. It was everywhere now, all around me, vibrating through the walls, through the very air I breathed. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was choking, suffocating, surrounded by darkness that was closing in, pulling me deeper into its grip. And then, just as I thought I would be lost forever, the door, the real door, appeared. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I ran. The shadows reached for me, their hands, if they even had hands, grasping at my legs, my arms, pulling me back. But I reached the door, threw it open, and ran out into the hallway, my legs unsteady, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as I ran, I could feel the camera in my hand. It wasn't done with me yet. I didn't stop running. The hallways stretched out before me like an endless labyrinth, their pale, sterile light flickering above. The air felt thick, heavy, as though every step I took made the atmosphere more oppressive. But I didn't dare look back. I didn't dare to even think about what might be following me. I just needed to get out. I needed to escape whatever had taken over my room, my reality, my mind. The camera was still clutched tightly in my hand, almost as if it had fused with my skin. It felt like it was pulling me in, like it was guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I stumbled through the hall, barely noticing the doors passing by. I didn't know where I was going. My feet moved on their own, instinctually, towards something, toward the unknown. But all I could think about was the photo I'd taken in that room, the one with the dark figures surrounding me. The one where they were looking straight at me, their glowing eyes burning into my soul. The hallway turned a corner, and I nearly collided with the wall as my legs gave out beneath me. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, the camera slipping from my hands. I didn't know how long I stayed there, crumpled on the ground. The only sound was the frantic beating of my heart and the whisper of my breath, shallow and ragged. And then I heard it. A soft click. I froze. My skin prickled with cold. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. It was in my head. The sound of the shutter. I looked down. The camera had fallen beside me, the lens facing up, still glowing faintly in the dim light. It was on. It was still on. My hands were trembling as I reached for it, my fingers slick with sweat. I turned it over, desperately trying to focus on the viewfinder. It was too blurry to make sense of, but the faint outline of the image seemed familiar. Then the camera whirred again, as if to tell me it was working. The photo was developing before my eyes. The light flashed, brighter than anything I had seen before. The image became clear. The photo. The figures. The eyes. The room. The stranger. But this time, something else was in the frame. I could see myself. I wasn't standing alone in the picture anymore. A second version of me stood in the background. It wasn't a reflection, it was me. But it wasn't me. The eyes were different. There was something wrong, something off. The figure was staring at me with a knowing, terrible look. The photo shifted. It warped, bending around the edges as if the very image itself was fighting to stay in focus. And then I saw it. The room wasn't my room. It wasn't even a room at all. It was a void. An endless, dark space filled with floating shadows. The walls dissolved, and all that was left was the dark figure in the distance, its glowing eyes locked on mine. My body trembled as I looked at the image, feeling the fear seep into every fiber of my being. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The camera was broken. It was malfunctioning. But the fear clawed at me, gnawing at my insides, making me question every thought, every doubt. The camera had shown me the truth. This was the end. The figure from the photo was real. The darkness, the void, was real. And I was already there. I looked up from the camera, staring at the hallway stretching in front of me. The lights were flickering even more violently now. The air was thick with an unshakable sense of finality. I could hear something moving behind me, soft footsteps, almost like breathing, whispering closer with every passing second. I was no longer in control. The knocking came again, distant at first, then louder. It was here. It was too late. I didn't run this time. I didn't scream. I just stood there, holding the camera, waiting for the inevitable. And as the first shadow touched my shoulder, I took the last photo. The world blurred. The camera clicked. I didn't expect a package. It wasn't my birthday, nor any special occasion. I had just returned from a long day of work, the usual routine that had begun to blur together in a monotony of time. The world outside was dark, cold, and wet from the rain that had fallen earlier. I walked through the front door, shrugging off my coat, not even noticing the small parcel left on the hallway table until I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. I turned. Nobody. Just the echo of my own steps in the empty house. I looked back at the package. It wasn't addressed to me, or at least not by name. The label was plain, no return address, just a faint scrawl that looked almost familiar. There was a slight tingle in my chest as I reached for it, but I ignored the feeling, brushing it off as tiredness. The shape was strange, too small for a large item, but bulky enough to be unsettling. I picked it up and felt the weight of it in my hands. There was something solid inside, pressing against the cardboard. I tore open the tape and slowly unfolded the box. A small gasp escaped my lips as I stared at the contents. Inside was a collection of things I hadn't seen in years, things that had disappeared long ago. A set of old keys. A silver necklace I'd worn every day for months before it vanished without a trace. A childhood photo of me and my sister laughing on the beach. A small, delicate porcelain doll that I used to keep on my nightstand, but it had disappeared when I was just a child. I froze. The strange, familiar feeling crept up my spine. I could feel my heart beating faster, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the items before me. The strangest part wasn't the things themselves. It was the note that had been tucked under the photo. "You'll need this soon." The handwriting was unmistakable. It was mine. I could feel my hands tremble as I held the note, the words seeming to burn into my skin. How could this be? I hadn't written this. But it was undeniable, the looping letters, the distinct slant of my own cursive. There was no mistaking it. What did this mean? How could these things be here? And why did the note say that I would need them? A chill ran down my spine as I looked back into the box. Everything seemed so ordinary, yet something about it felt off. The necklace. The doll. The photograph. They all felt like pieces of something that didn't belong. I had lost these things so long ago, never knowing what had happened to them. But now, it seemed like they had been waiting for me, patiently, to return. I heard something then. A soft creaking, like footsteps on the stairs. My pulse quickened. My eyes darted to the hallway, but I saw nothing. The house felt colder now, the walls pressing in, as if the very air was growing heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned back to the box. The things seemed almost alive, waiting to be acknowledged, to be touched, to be part of something I didn't understand. I swallowed, my throat dry, and looked at the note again. "You'll need this soon." What did that even mean? The creaking grew louder, closer. I stood frozen, unable to look away from the box. Then, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the silence of the house like a knife. I jumped, startled. My breath caught in my throat. Who could be at the door at this hour? I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I set the box down quickly and moved toward the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. I peeked through the peephole, but there was nobody there. Nothing. Just the darkness of the night stretching out beyond the porch. I stood there for a moment, confused, trying to make sense of the situation. But the feeling in my chest wouldn't leave. Something was wrong. Something had changed. I stepped back from the door, the weight of the box and my mind pulling me back to it. The note. The items. The strange feeling of déjà vu. But as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a fresh footprint on the floor inside the entryway. And it was only a few inches from where I had been standing. The footprint was real. I wasn't imagining it. I stood frozen, my hand still hovering over the door handle, staring at the dark smudge on the floor. It was a single, muddy print, clear and distinct. I hadn't seen it before. I would have noticed it when I came in, wouldn't I? But now it was there, just a few steps from where I stood. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. The house felt suddenly too quiet, too still. The only sound I could hear was the thudding of my own heart in my chest. I slowly let go of the door handle and took a cautious step forward, kneeling down to examine the print. The mud was dark and sticky, like it had been tracked in just moments before. But there was no way it could have been. I was alone in the house. I had been for hours. I stood up quickly, looking around, my eyes darting across the entryway. There were no other signs of intrusion, no broken windows, no open doors. Just a print. And the unease that was starting to take over. I glanced back toward the living room, my mind racing. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was I imagining all of this? The package, the note, the footprint, was it all connected somehow? Was this some kind of cruel joke? But no! I knew the footprint wasn't a trick. I hadn't left it, and I hadn't heard anyone enter the house. My thoughts were a blur of confusion and fear, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me. Then, I heard it again, the soft creak of floorboards, but this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from behind me. I spun around. There, in the hallway, just past the open door of the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow. A figure. It was a person, but they were wrong. Their shape didn't quite make sense, like they were distorted, stretched out of focus, as though they didn't belong in the space they were occupying. My mind couldn't quite process it, couldn't understand what it was seeing. The figure stood perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It felt like it had been there for a long time, but I hadn't noticed it, like it had always been waiting. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. I blinked, disoriented, and looked around, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But there was nothing, no sign of movement, no sound. Just the oppressive silence. My heart raced, and I was aware of the cold sweat on the back of my neck. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I knew it wasn't normal. Nothing about this situation felt normal. I looked back at the footprint, but it didn't seem to make sense anymore. It was almost as if it had always been there, part of the story that had started the moment I received the package. The items, the note, the footprint, it all felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve, but one that was closing in on me with each passing second. The figure. The figure from the hallway. It couldn't be real. Could it? I glanced at the box on the table again, my fingers itching to reach for it, to see if it held any answers. But something deep inside me screamed to stay away, to leave it alone. It felt like the box was a doorway to something I wasn't ready to confront. Yet, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. I turned back toward the living room, my eyes scanning every corner of the room, every shadow, every unfamiliar shape that seemed to shift just beyond my sight. I walked slowly, deliberately, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The floor creaked under my weight, and I couldn't help but feel as though I were being drawn towards something I couldn't see, something that was waiting. I stopped in front of the table, the box sitting innocently in front of me. The items inside seemed so ordinary now, like they belonged to someone else. Someone from a past life I had left behind. But there was one item left in the box that I hadn't looked at yet. It was the small porcelain doll, the one I had lost when I was a child. I reached for it with trembling hands, feeling its smooth, cold surface. The doll's face was delicate, its features painted with faint, almost imperceptible cracks. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettling, like it had been through something I couldn't comprehend. As I held it, something caught my eye. The doll's eyes, they were moving. Or at least, that's what it seemed like. A subtle shift, a barely noticeable twitch, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I dropped the doll back into the box, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no mistaking it now. Something was wrong. Something was happening. And I was trapped in the middle of it. The room felt colder now. The air was thick, and the silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that the items in the box weren't just remnants of my past, they were pieces of something bigger. Something dangerous. Something that I couldn't escape. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The air in the house had grown heavier, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the walls themselves were watching, waiting for me to make a move. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive, as though every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind outside was amplified 1,000 times. I stared at the box on the table, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't organize. The doll's eyes, that subtle shift, that impossible movement. My heart was still pounding from the shock of it, and every instinct told me to leave, to get out of this house. But I couldn't. I looked around the room again, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. The objects on the shelves, the framed photos on the walls, they all seemed so ordinary. So safe. But in this moment, everything felt alien, foreign. As if these familiar objects were hiding something beneath the surface. I heard it again, the floorboard creaking behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing. Only shadows. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. My mind was already running in circles, and I was starting to doubt what was real. But then, the temperature dropped sharply, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel something moving in the air, something just out of reach of my senses. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud now. I took a hesitant step toward the door, wanting nothing more than to run. But as my hand touched the cold doorknob, I froze. A flicker of movement caught my eye across the room in the reflection of the mirror. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see, but I couldn't stop myself. There, standing just beyond the threshold of the hallway, was the figure. The same one I had seen earlier, its shape distorted and wrong, stretching unnaturally. It stood perfectly still, as though it were waiting for me to make a move. Its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being pulled into its orbit. I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the mirror. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and penetrating. It knew I was watching, and yet it made no move to approach. It just stood there, an impossible silhouette in the reflection, waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. What did it want from me? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. I couldn't think clearly. The air felt too thick, like something was pressing down on my chest. I needed to get out of this house, away from whatever was in that reflection, whatever was waiting for me. But as I turned toward the door again, my gaze fell on the box. The porcelain doll. The note that had come with it, "You'll need this again." I didn't know why, but I knew I had to open the box again. I had to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting the fear that had been creeping up on me since the moment I received that package. With trembling hands, I reached for the box, lifting the lid slowly. The doll was still there, its porcelain skin cold to the touch. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers brushing over the doll's features. It felt strangely familiar, as though I had always known it would be there. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to face this. Whatever was happening, I had to know. The note, the figure, the doll, it was all connected. Somehow. I picked up the doll again, my fingers brushing against its smooth surface. It felt like it was alive in my hands, its weight shifting slightly as I held it. I looked into its painted eyes, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then I saw it. A small, barely noticeable detail that had been hidden all along. The doll's right hand, there was something written on it. Tiny letters, almost too small to read. I squinted, holding it closer to the light. It took a moment, but then the words came into focus. Look closer. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a toy. This wasn't something from my childhood. This was a warning. A message. And it was clear now, it wasn't over. The presence, the figure, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I set the doll down on the table and looked around the room. The walls felt closer now, as if they were closing in. The air was thicker. The creaks in the floorboards louder. And then I heard something new. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. It was coming from upstairs. I froze. The figure in the reflection. The shadow in the hallway. The scratching sound, it was all connected. But what did it mean? What was waiting for me upstairs? I took a deep breath, fighting the rising panic in my chest. I had to go upstairs. I had to find out what it wanted. The stairs creaked underfoot as I ascended, each step echoing through the silence of the house. The scratching noise had stopped, but the air was still thick with tension, almost like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the flickering light from the far end. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to shift, stretching and warping as though they were alive, moving on their own. The house felt like it was shifting around me, changing as I moved deeper into its bowels. I turned my head, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision, remained. As I walked down the hallway, the silence grew deafening. The only sound was the faint sound of my breath, ragged and shallow. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the attic. It had always been locked, but now it was slightly ajar. I couldn't remember leaving it like that. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The attic was dark, the air stale and thick with dust. The beams overhead groaned under the weight of years of neglect. The light from the hallway barely pierced the darkness, casting strange shadows on the walls. But it was the silence that unsettled me most. It felt like the attic was waiting, holding its breath, just like the rest of the house. I stepped inside, my heart racing. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the piles of old furniture, forgotten boxes, and dust-covered tarps. There was a sense of finality in the air, like this was the place where everything had started and everything was about to end. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved deeper into the attic. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, near the window, was a small wooden table. On it sat a box, exactly like the one that had arrived in the mail. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it. It was almost as if the house had been guiding me here, to this very moment. I reached out to touch the box, but something stopped me. A feeling, cold and heavy, settled in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was as if the box was alive, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I took a step back, but the floor beneath me shifted, sending a sudden shiver of panic through me. My eyes darted back to the table. The box was now open. I froze. Inside the box was something that wasn't there before. A photograph. It was a picture of me, but not from any time I could remember. The woman in the photo was standing in the very same attic, her eyes staring directly at the camera. Her expression was blank, emotionless, almost like she wasn't even aware of the camera. I took a sharp breath. My hand shook as I picked up the photograph. It felt cold, as if it had been stored in a place where time didn't exist. The edges were frayed, worn, as if the picture had been touched countless times. But it wasn't just the photo that terrified me. It was what was behind me, reflected in the glass. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. It was no longer a shadow, it had form, shape, and presence. Its face was just barely visible, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. It was almost like looking into a mirror, but the reflection didn't belong to me. I turned around, heart racing in my chest. The attic was empty. The figure was gone. I looked back at the photograph, my breath quickening. It wasn't just me in the picture anymore. There, standing beside me, was someone else. Someone unfamiliar. A man, his face hidden by the shadows. But his presence was undeniable. The scratching noise started again. Faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. It was coming from the far corner of the attic, where the boxes were piled high. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and dread. Something was in that corner. Something that I couldn't see yet, but I knew it was there. I took a step backward, but before I could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. I heard the shuffle of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. A cold wind blew through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something ancient, decaying. I turned, rushing for the door, but the door slammed shut in front of me with a deafening crash. My heart skipped a beat as I pressed my palms against the wood, feeling the temperature drop rapidly. It was as if something was blocking me from escaping. I stumbled back, my mind racing for a way out. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could feel the air thickening, pressing in around me. The walls seemed to be closing in. There was no escape. I looked around, panic setting in. And then, in the far corner of the attic, I saw it. The figure was standing there, watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The shadows around it twisted, stretching out like tendrils, reaching for me. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time seemed irrelevant in the suffocating darkness. When I awoke, I was still in the attic, lying on the floor. My limbs felt heavy, as though I had been asleep for far longer than just a few moments. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the smell of decay lingered in my nose like something forgotten. I pushed myself to my feet, my hands trembling. The attic looked the same, but something was different, unnerving. The air around me felt charged, as though the house itself was alive, breathing with me. I quickly scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the figure, but the cold presence lingered, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The light from the hallway outside flickered weakly through the cracked door. I stumbled toward it, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence. My head ached, and every part of my body felt like it was made of lead. The photograph was still on the table. I hadn't imagined it. The image was real, staring back at me, now framed in a way that seemed far more ominous. The figure that had been behind me was no longer in the shadows. It was clear, defined, its face now unmistakable, a face I knew. A face I had seen once, long ago. It was my own. But not the me I knew. It was a version of myself from another life, or perhaps an alternate reality. The eyes were cold, almost lifeless, as if I was looking at a reflection of myself that never lived. I shook my head, the fear creeping into my bones. This can't be happening. This can't be real. The scratching noise returned, closer now. It was sharp, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but now it sounded as though it was coming from within the walls themselves. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I could feel it vibrating through the floor, through my feet, up into my body. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before whatever it was caught me. I grabbed the photograph, clutching it in my hand as I backed toward the door. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, my chest tightening with each passing second. The floor beneath me creaked, and I froze, waiting, straining to hear any movement. The door, still slightly ajar, was my only escape. But the shadows in the corner of the room, they were shifting. The darkness was moving, contorting into shapes that were too unnatural to be anything but wrong. No, don't look at it. But my eyes betrayed me. They were drawn to the shadows. Slowly, the figure materialized, emerging from the blackness like smoke, its form flickering as if it were struggling to hold its shape. It was there, standing at the far end of the attic, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that paralyzed me where I stood. I could feel it. I knew it. This was not just a figure. It was me. Or something that was me. The footsteps came closer, each one like a drumbeat echoing in the silence. The thing that looked like me, raised a hand, its fingers curled into a grotesque shape. I took a step back, my pulse racing as the air around me grew colder. "You shouldn't have come back," it said again. The voice was my own, but twisted, like an echo from deep within a nightmare. You never should have come back. I turned and bolted for the door, not caring how loud I was anymore. The air seemed to close in on me, and the shadows clawed at the edges of my vision, pulling me back toward the thing in the corner. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash as I reached it. I tugged at the knob, my hand shaking violently. It wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, desperate to escape, but the door felt like it was alive, resisting my every attempt. "You can't escape," came the voice again. This time, it was behind me, its breath hot and rancid against my ear. I turned around, and there it was, closer now, too close. The thing that looked like me was standing right in front of me, its cold eyes boring into mine, its face twisted with something I couldn't place. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The photograph slipped from my hand and fluttered across the ground. The room spun as I tried to stand, but the weight of the air, the cold, and the presence pressing in on me was too much. I couldn't breathe. It leaned down toward me, its breath sharp and ragged. Its face was only inches from mine now. I could see my own reflection in its dark eyes, but it was wrong. "You always knew," it whispered. "You always knew you couldn't leave." The words hit me like a blow, and for the first time, I realized something. This wasn't just about the house, or the photograph, or the boxes. This was something that had been waiting for me all along. The house had always known I'd come back, just like the figure had always known I'd return. It had been leading me here, bringing me face to face with something that wasn't just my past, but a part of me that I had forgotten. A part of me that had been waiting. The floor beneath me started to crack, the sound growing louder, like the house itself was coming apart. "It's too late," the figure said, its voice now a twisted mockery of my own. "You're already part of it." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And then, everything went black. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.